Tonight we travel into the darkness that followed Rome's departure from Britain, into a world where stone walls still stood, but the certainty that built them had begun to rot away. We enter not through legend at first, but through evidence. Archaeologists working at former Roman towns and military sites across Britain have uncovered layers of abandonment, hurried reuse, and slow decay that point to a society losing the machinery that once held it together. Coins stop appearing in meaningful numbers. Public buildings are broken up for salvage. Fine imported pottery becomes rare. At places like Wroxeter, Londinium, and the forts near Hadrian's Wall, stratigraphic excavation shows not a single apocalyptic moment, but a long unwinding. The empire did not vanish with one dramatic cry. It thinned, weakened, and then left the people of Britain to face the wind alone. In the early 5th century, Roman authority in Britain became increasingly fragile. Troops had been pulled away to fight on the continent. Imperial administration faltered. Messages from distant emperors meant less when no pay arrived, when roads went unmaintained, and when the granaries that had once fed soldiers and officials no longer moved with dependable rhythm. The vast imperial system that had linked Britain to Gaul, to the Mediterranean, and to the wider Roman world had been an artificial triumph over distance and weather. Once that system cracked, the island's exposed edges became impossible to ignore. Britain was never a calm place, only a place disciplined by force, tax, and habit. Once these softened, older fears returned. Imagine the island then. In the west, hills wrapped in mist. In the north, the frontier country beyond the wall, bitter and restless. In the southeast, the old ports facing the narrow sea, open to both trade and danger. Roman Britain had once been a province of roads, market towns, tiled roofs, heated baths, shrines, workshops, and a confident bureaucracy. Even far from Rome itself, its elite had dined from imported tableware, read Latin inscriptions, and walked through towns planned on the imperial grid. Yet beneath that polished surface, the province had always relied on movement. Soldiers moved, grain moved, orders moved, silver moved. Once movement failed, stillness became a kind of death. The old cities did not all burn at once. That is one of the strangest and most haunting truths. Some simply quieted. Public life shrank. Forums that had once heard business and law fell silent. Bathhouses cooled. Drains clogged. Roofs sagged. In some places, people kept living among the bones of the Roman world, making smaller lives inside larger ruins. A great town could become a patchwork of occupied corners, gardens where courtyards had been, livestock wandering between broken walls. The monumental shell remained, but the confidence that had animated it was gone. A basilica without clerks is only a tall room. A road without tax collectors and patrols is only a hard strip across the land. The people of Britain were not passive witnesses to collapse. They adapted as people always do. Local strongmen emerged. Civic leaders tried to preserve order. Churchmen became more important where bureaucrats no longer appeared. Men who once defined themselves through Roman office or military rank had to reinvent authority in a harsher landscape. Some likely clung to the memory of empire, dressing in its titles and manners long after the machinery itself had failed. Others turned toward older loyalties, family, district, hill fort, and tribe. In such times, identity narrows. A man ceases to belong to a world and begins to belong only to those within sight of his fire. The natural world pressed harder too. Fields had to be planted whether emperors ruled or not. Livestock had to be guarded. Winter still came across the island with wet cold and long darkness. The difference now was that there was less room for failure. A mist harvest, a raid on a storehouse, the loss of a bridge. These could tip a district from hardship into hunger. Roman rule had not removed violence from Britain, but it had organized response. Now response itself became uncertain. If raiders struck a coastal farmstead, who came? If a frontier settlement was attacked, who answered the signal? In many places, perhaps no one, across the sea, other eyes were watching. The Germanic world beyond the North Sea was not a single united force, but a shifting mosaic of peoples, loyalties, and ambitions. Saxons, Angles, Jutes, and others lived in societies that valued kin, war skill, gift exchange, and the reputation of chieftains. For some, Britain offered plunder. For others, employment. For others, still, land. The weakening of Roman Britain was not hidden from them. Shorelines that had once been guarded became tempting. Estuaries became doors. The sea, so often imagined as a boundary, became a road. There is an old bitterness in the tradition that follows. Later writers describe desperate appeals, frightened communities, and the sense that the island had been left to itself at the edge of the world. Whether every detail is reliable matters less, for the moment, than the emotional truth preserved in those accounts. People felt abandoned. That feeling can shape history as sharply as any army. To know that help is not coming changes the way a village sleeps, the way a leader speaks, the way a parent looks toward the horizon at dusk. Every rumor grows claws. Every sail offshore becomes a threat. And yet, this was not only an age of fear, it was also an age of terrible creation. In the collapse of one order, the raw materials of another began to gather. Speech changed. Power changed. Sacred places changed. The island that Rome had claimed as Britannia was beginning to fracture into different futures. Some communities remained deeply shaped by Roman habits and Christian belief. Others would be transformed by incoming warrior groups with different languages, customs, and cosmologies. Between them lay not a neat border, but a shifting zone of contact, violence, bargaining, marriage, and revenge. What makes this age so gripping is that it stands half in light and half in shadow. Archaeology gives us fragments, a cemetery here, a hoard there, a ruined hall, a weapon burial, a line of earthworks, a collapsed granary, genomic data, isotopic testing, and lithic or material analysis can tell us where some people came from, what they ate, how objects were made, and how communities changed. But the inner life of the age remains elusive. We do not hear the full conversation spoken beside ruined villas. We do not know every oath sworn by torchlight in timber halls. We do not know all the names of those who stood on the shore and saw the old world ending. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. Britain after Rome is not only a story of decline, it is a story of exposure. Remove the empire, and the island reveals its raw grain. Its distances grow larger. Its weather grows harsher. Its enemies grow nearer. Its people become visible not as a province in a map book, but as men and women making choices with too little certainty and too much memory. The war that would help create Britain, and later England, did not begin with triumphant banners. It began in silence, in uncertainty, in the cold spaces left behind when the last reliable order failed and the island had to discover, through blood and endurance, what it would become, The first clues to this story do not come from kings speaking in triumph or monks writing by candlelight. They come from earth, from ash, from broken masonry, from places where trowels scrape across compacted layers and reveal a world losing its shape. Post-Roman Britain survives in the ground as a problem of silence. Archaeologists do not uncover a single clean line that says empire ended here. Instead, they find interruption, reuse, neglect, and strange persistence. A forum becomes a dumping ground. A villa becomes a quarry. A bathhouse, once warm with circulating heat and bright with painted plaster, stands roofless beneath rain and drifting weeds. The story begins in these changes, not in speeches, but in material habits that stop making sense because the system that supported them has gone. At Wroxeter, one of the largest cities in Roman Britain, the remains of monumental buildings suggest a place that did not vanish in an instant. The city endured, but differently. Streets that had once directed ordered movement through a civic landscape no longer served the same rhythm of life. Public buildings decayed or were adapted in smaller, humbler ways. Imported goods, once signs of stable exchange with distant provinces, become fewer. The market of empire had thinned. Fine red pottery from the continent, glassware, luxury goods, and coinage no longer flowed in the steady streams that had nourished urban confidence. A city could still stand in stone and brick, but if trade collapsed and administration weakened, its grand architecture became a memory without the means to renew itself. Londinium offers another kind of testimony. Roman London had been a center of exchange, law, and movement, tied to river traffic and imperial networks. Yet the archaeology of the 5th century gives the impression of contraction. Areas that had once been built up fall quiet. Population seems to thin. Defenses remain imposing, but walls alone do not create a living city. A fortress can enclose emptiness as easily as strength. In the afterlife of empire, many urban spaces across Britain appear to have shrunk into islands of occupation surrounded by ruins. One district might remain useful while another falls into rubble. Gardens appear in places once paved. Domestic activity returns to spaces not designed for it. The civic idea of the city gives way to survival within its shell. Coins tell their own bleak story. Roman Britain had been saturated with coinage, the small metal pulse of taxation, military pay, trade, and public life. But by the early 5th century, fresh supplies dry up. What remains circulates unevenly, then dwindles into relic value. A coin in such an age is no longer simply money. It can become jewelry, heirloom, token, or scrap. The disappearance of coinage matters because it suggests more than financial stress. It hints at the collapse of habits. Market exchange changes. State presence fades. The ordinary expectation that value can be measured, stored, and recognized across the province becomes harder to sustain. When coins stop moving, the silence is administrative as much as economic. The villas of the countryside feel especially haunting in this regard. These had been the homes of the provincial elite, places of mosaics, bath suites, storerooms, barns, and carefully managed estates. Some survived for a time after imperial rule frayed. Others were abandoned, stripped, or repurposed. Roof tiles were taken. Dressed stone was removed. Decorative interiors fell into weather and rot. Yet not every villa ended with flames. Many seem to have faded through disuse, as if the landowners no longer possessed the labor, wealth, or security needed to maintain such structures. A grand house in a disordering world becomes a liability. It declares status, but also attracts danger. It requires systems of production and deference that collapse when armed men move freely, and central authority no longer guarantees order. Far to the north, the military zones reveal another layer of unraveling. The forts near Hadrian's Wall had once formed part of one of the most disciplined landscapes in the empire. Garrisons, supply depots, roads, and watchpoints imposed a hard logic upon the frontier. Yet when troops were withdrawn or underpaid, when command chains weakened, the frontier ceased to function as a frontier in the Roman sense. Defenses might still stand, but the living pattern that gave them meaning broke down. Some forts lingered as occupied sites, but the old system of imperial border control no longer held firm. The wall itself, massive and mute, could not preserve an empire once men stopped filling its towers and marching its roads. Written testimony from the age is sparse and often troubled, but the archaeology deepens what those anxious voices imply. Britain did not simply lose Roman rule, it lost connectedness. The province had depended on roads maintained by state labor, taxes gathered through bureaucratic routine, military logistics organized at scale, and a political imagination that saw Britain as part of something larger. Once this connectedness failed, local regions became more isolated. A town might endure for a while on memory and inertia. A valley might continue farming much as before. A bishop might still preach. A local magnate might still feast retainers. But these were fragments of continuation, not proof of stability. This is why the discovery story matters so much. Excavation in post-Roman contexts often forces scholars to read against disappearance. Historians are trained to interpret monuments, records, and institutions. But here, often, we interpret absence, missing imports, missing repairs, missing coinage, missing burials of one kind replaced by another, missing evidence for public investment. The disappearance of pattern becomes evidence in itself. Stratigraphy reveals neglect where once there had been maintenance. Burn layers sometimes signal violence, but equally powerful are the signs of roofs collapsing slowly and floors filling with wind-blown debris. A violent end is dramatic. A neglected end is colder. Yet out of this decline came vivid local worlds. Timber halls appear where stone civic buildings once dominated. Smaller defended sites gain importance. Reused Roman materials turn up in rougher structures, as if the old empire is being broken apart and fed into something rougher and more immediate. Christianity remains in some areas, but its institutions operate within a harsher environment. Latin lingers among clerics and elites, yet other tongues rise in strength. The archaeological record becomes less Roman not because life ceased, but because its organizing principles changed. People still ate, buried their dead, built homes, traded goods, forged weapons, and told stories. They simply did so in ways that belonged to a new and less unified age. This is the first true revelation of the post-Roman world. The island did not become empty. It became fragmented. That fragmentation can feel elusive because it resists neat narrative, but it is written everywhere in the evidence. In shattered mosaic floors, in abandoned public baths, in the shrinking range of material exchange, in the fading of coin use, in forts that stand beyond the life that once animated them. The discovery of this lost Britain has been slow and often answerless, adrift to ponder. Each trench, each cemetery, each ruined estate adds another shard to the picture. Together they show a society not yet reborn, but no longer imperial, suspended in a hard and dangerous twilight where every stone still remembered Rome. Even as Britain itself was becoming something else, along the coasts of Britain, the end of Roman order was felt first as exposure. The sea had always brought danger, but under empire it had also brought commerce, messages, officials, and military movement. Once the institutions of Rome weakened, the same waters became something more intimate and terrifying. They became open roads for opportunists, estuaries, harbors, and tidal rivers that had once linked Britain to a protected imperial world now lay vulnerable. Shore communities learned to read the horizon with a different kind of attention. A sail offshore no longer promised trade alone. It could mean plunder, fire, and the sudden breaking apart of everything stored for winter. Roman commanders had long feared seaborne raids. The so-called Saxon shore forts, stretching along parts of the southeastern and eastern coasts, had been built to answer precisely this problem. These were not symbolic works. They were hard, practical defenses, thick-walled installations designed to guard approaches and organize military response. Their very existence reveals that seaborne pressure was no fantasy. Yet forts are only as strong as the systems that provision and command them. In the last years of Roman Britain, those systems frayed. Garrisons were reduced or withdrawn. Maintenance failed. Coordination weakened. A fort without enough men is an empty jaw with missing teeth. Once the empire's grip loosened, the coastline ceased to function as a defended border and became instead a vulnerable seam. To understand the violence that followed, it is important to imagine the geography properly. Britain is not merely an island surrounded by water. It is an island of inlets, river mouths, marshes, and low accessible coasts. The east and southeast in particular face toward the continental world across relatively narrow seas. A skilled mariner in a light craft did not need to cross an endless ocean. He needed only weather, timing, and nerve. The sea linked Britain to regions occupied by peoples who were already familiar with raiding, migration, trade, and military service. This was not a distant foreign world. It was a neighboring one. In the north and west, danger came by different routes. The old Roman frontier had never erased the independence of the peoples beyond it. The Picts to the north remained a constant anxiety in late Roman sources, their attacks becoming part of the province's recurring fear. To the west, Irish raiders, identified in Roman accounts as Scotti, also exploited weakness along exposed coasts. Britain, after Rome, therefore faced pressure not from one direction, but from many. A coastal village in the west feared one kind of raid. A river settlement in the east feared another. A farming district near the northern frontier might dread mounted or fast-moving war bands sweeping down through broken defenses. The island was ringed with uncertainty. The archaeology of these pressures is often indirect, but powerful. Hoards buried and not recovered suggest fear and disruption. Burn layers at some settlements hint at violent episodes. Defensive earthworks are reused or strengthened. Hill forts, some of them ancient long before Rome arrived, regain importance in certain regions, not necessarily as simple military sites, but as places of refuge and authority. Such choices matter. When people return to older defensible places, they are admitting that the open landscape no longer feels secure. A villa can proclaim status in peacetime. A hilltop enclosure speaks a harsher language. It says that visibility, height, and difficult access matter again. Written voices from this era, though later and often partisan, preserve the emotional climate of repeated assault. They speak of groans, lamentation, devastation, and helplessness. Such language may be stylized, but it reflects a real political truth. Raiding is more than theft. It is a method of teaching fear. A raider need not hold territory to alter a region permanently. He needs only to arrive unpredictably, burn selectively, kill enough to create memory, and depart with captives, food, or treasure. Once that pattern begins, whole communities change their behavior. They store differently, travel less, sleep lightly, trust strangers less, move inland if they can, abandon exposed farms. Violence spreads beyond the moment of attack by reshaping every expectation that follows it. These pressures also transformed leadership. In a stable province, administration can feel distant and routine. In a threatened land, people want immediate protection. Leaders who can gather fighters, build alliances, and respond quickly become valuable in a new way. The decline of Roman command, therefore, did not produce a neat vacuum. It produced competition. Local elites, former officers, ambitious war leaders, and kin-based strongmen all had reason to claim authority. The more dangerous the coastlines became, the more valuable military charisma became inland. Protection and power began to merge. Across the North Sea, the societies commonly grouped under names such as Saxons, Angles, and Jutes were themselves dynamic and not fixed in modern ethnic terms. Some men came as raiders. Others may have arrived as mercenaries, invited by British leaders desperate for military support. Others came as settlers, bringing households and long-term ambition. The distinction matters, but on the ground, these categories could blur. A hired warband might demand land. A raider who found weakness might return with family. A migrant community might arrive first under one leader and then draw in others. The shoreline became a zone where violence and opportunity met. What began as predation could become colonization. For the ordinary inhabitants of lowland Britain, this meant living inside a widening uncertainty. A coastline once open to exchange now felt porous and dangerous. River systems, those great arteries of movement, could carry enemies deep inland. Even successful defense came at a cost. Men drawn into coastal warbands were not plowing fields. Food devoted to feeding fighters was food not saved for bad harvests. Communities under constant threat become poorer even when they survive. Scarcity deepens grievance. Grievance invites faction. The enemy outside the settlement is only part of the story. Pressure from outside can make enemies inside as well. There is also the matter of memory. People living through these years likely remembered Rome not only as domination, but as structure. They remembered patrols, walls manned, taxes collected, governors known by name, and roads that still carried authority. The contrast with the 5th century must have felt severe. The sea had not changed. The tides still breathed through the marshes. Salt wind still struck the eastern shore. But the human meaning of the coastline had altered. Under empire, it had been a monitored threshold. Now it was a breach. This is how the brutal war that helped create Britain truly began. Not yet with famous battles, but with exposure. The island was no longer secured by a power larger than itself. Coastal raids, frontier attacks, and growing migration turned geography into fate. Harbors became entry points for new peoples. Rivers became corridors of fear. Communities that had once trusted in distant institutions learned that distance now meant abandonment. Along those watchful shores, in the anxious glance toward every unfamiliar sail, a new age was gathering itself from salt, fire, and blood. When Rome withdrew, Britain did not suddenly forget how to govern. What vanished was not memory, but the machinery that turned memory into power. The island still held men who understood taxation, logistics, law, and command. Bishops still preached. Landowners still expected labor from the soil. Former officials still knew how documents ought to work, how orders ought to be given, how roads ought to connect town to town. Yet knowledge without institutions is a fragile inheritance. In the 5th century, the people of Britain found themselves living among Roman habits after the Roman state had faded. They were heirs to an imperial language of order, but no longer possessed the full means to speak it aloud. In the old provincial towns, some civic life endured. Local leaders did not simply disappear because emperors stopped sending letters. Men of standing, whether urban elites, military officers, or wealthy landholders, still had clients, households, and obligations. Some communities likely tried to preserve the forms of Roman life for as long as possible. Councils may have met in reduced fashion. Taxes, if collected at all, were probably gathered locally rather than as part of a dependable imperial chain. Churches remained important because they offered continuity where state structures had failed. A bishop could provide moral authority, literacy, and access to networks of memory that outlasted soldiers and governors. In troubled times, men who could read, persuade, and organize became as precious as men who could fight. But the scale had changed. Rome governed at a level beyond the reach of local improvisation. It coordinated roads, grain supply, military deployments, frontier defense, long-distance trade, and official justice across a vast and varied island. Once that framework weakened, Britain became a landscape of local solutions. One valley might still be effectively ruled by a wealthy estate owner. One town might rally around its church. Another district might depend on a former military commander who had enough personal loyalty to keep armed retainers at hand. These were not trivial arrangements. They kept people alive, yet they could not easily restore provincial unity. The larger picture had shattered into a patchwork. There was a temptation to imagine that the Britons simply turned inward and became tribal again, as if Roman life had been a thin paint that quickly washed away. The reality was more complex and far more poignant. People carried Rome inside them. They used Roman titles long after the empire's force had drained away. They occupied Roman towns, reused Roman stone, and worshipped in a Christianity shaped by the Roman world. They may even have dressed, spoken, and judged themselves by standards inherited from that older civilization. This is what made the age so unstable. The people of Britain did not see themselves as beginning from nothing. They saw themselves as living after something immense and trying, with too few resources, to keep it from collapsing entirely. In such a world, legitimacy became deeply contested. Why should one man command another under Rome? The answer had once been clear, or at least formally clear. The emperor ruled through governors, officers, magistrates, and law. In post-Roman Britain, legitimacy had to be reconstructed out of land, ancestry, military success, Christian standing, and personal reputation. A leader might claim authority because his family had served the Romans, another because he could raise fighters, another because he protected a monastery or supported a bishop, another because he held a defensible stronghold and controlled a food-rich district. This made politics more immediate and more dangerous. Power was no longer guaranteed by office alone. It had to be proved constantly. The ordinary people of Britain, farmers, herders, craftsmen, servants, and dependents, were caught inside this transformation. Their world narrowed. Under empire, A peasant may never have seen Rome, but he lived inside its consequences. Roads connected his produce to markets. Coinage connected him to exchange. Military order made some districts safer than they otherwise would have been. In the 5th century, much of that invisible protection thinned. A village now depended more heavily on whoever could defend its grain, mediate disputes, and prevent raiders from carrying off livestock or children. Loyalty became personal. That shift matters. When institutions fail, people do not stop seeking order. They simply seek it at closer range. Religion offered one of the strongest threads of continuity. Christianity had taken root in Roman Britain, and while its institutional reach after the imperial withdrawal is debated, there is little doubt that Christian belief remained influential in many British communities. Priests and bishops could provide not only spiritual guidance, but also cultural coherence. The Church preserved literacy. It preserved memory. It preserved a moral language that stood above local feuds, at least in theory. Yet even Christian communities lived in a harsher political climate. A bishop without armed support could preach peace, but he could not enforce it. Sacred authority and military necessity often had to coexist uneasily. At the same time, the countryside began to matter even more than before. If cities contracted and public administration weakened, wealth returned more directly to land, food, and manpower. A strong local ruler needed followers, and followers needed feeding. Control over fertile ground, river crossings, and defensible heights could make the difference between brief influence and lasting command. Thus, the old Roman province slowly transformed into a mosaic of regional powers. Some were probably little more than armed households with pretensions. Others may have approached something like small kingdoms in all but name. The line between landlord, war leader, and ruler grew thin. This was also an age of negotiation. Not every encounter ended in battle. British leaders made arrangements, formed alliances, hired outside fighters, and perhaps even granted land in exchange for service. Such decisions were not necessarily foolish at the time. In a fractured land, immediate survival often outweighed long-term caution. A chieftain threatened by raiders might gladly employ foreign warriors if they promised protection. A district short on fighting men might welcome a group of settlers who could hold a vulnerable frontier. But decisions made under pressure can reshape a country beyond recognition. A temporary bargain can become a permanent transformation. The most haunting part of this political world is that it was built from both resilience and exhaustion. Britain did not collapse because its people forgot courage or intelligence. It collapsed because the scale of imperial governance had been removed, and no local force could easily replace it. What remained were communities trying to preserve fragments of order while danger pressed from coast, frontier, and within. Some leaders rose to the moment. Others failed. Some protected. Others exploited. The old Roman world left behind roads, walls, churches, villas, and the memory of discipline. But memory cannot patrol a coastline. It cannot pay a garrison. It cannot command obedience forever. So the Britons lived in a land both familiar and altered. The stones were Roman. The prayers were often Christian. The language of prestige still carried the breath of empire. Yet the reality of power was becoming local, improvised, and martial. Britain after Rome was not a blank space waiting to be filled. It was a crowded and anxious inheritance, where men who still thought in Roman terms were forced to rule in a world that was becoming something else. A world harder, more fragmented, and increasingly defined by whoever could hold the land when law alone no longer could. Across Britain, The ruins of Rome did not disappear into the earth at once. They remained visible, enormous, and often unsettling, as if the island had inherited the skeleton of a giant. A traveler moving through the 5th century might still have seen walls of dressed stone rising over fields gone rough with weeds, roofless bathhouses open to rain and birds, villa courtyards choked with grass, and stretches of old road running firm and level through country that no longer possessed the power that built them. These ruins were not ancient in the way we think of antiquity now. They were recent enough to sting. Many people still living had grown up in a world where such structures were useful, meaningful, and alive. To see them decaying was to witness not only loss, but reversal. Archaeology gives these places a strange emotional clarity. Stone survives where certainty does not. Excavators working at villa sites, town compounds, and former public buildings often uncover evidence not of immediate destruction, but of abandonment followed by opportunistic reuse. Masonry is taken away for smaller projects. Fine floors crack beneath weather and neglect. Hearths appear in rooms never designed for humble domestic life. Timber structures rise within the shells of older stone complexes, as if people were withdrawing from the grand scale of Roman architecture and creating something more manageable inside it. This is one of the most intimate signatures of collapse. The new world does not always erase the old. It shelters within it, reduces it, scavenges it, and learns to live among its fragments. The villas are especially eloquent in this regard. These country houses had once been expressions of wealth, status, and confidence. They stood at the center of productive estates, connected to storage, labor, and exchange. Mosaic pavements, plastered walls, heated rooms, and carefully planned layouts all spoke of a society that could command resources over time. But when the conditions that sustained this order weakened, the villas became vulnerable. Some were stripped methodically, tile by tile, beam by beam. Their useful parts were carried away. Others lingered in partial occupation, their grand rooms too expensive to maintain, their ornamental spaces collapsing into practical disorder. A hall meant for display could become a shelter for animals. A bath suite could become a dumping place. A life once arranged by elegance becomes reorganized by necessity. Town ruins tell a slightly different story. In some urban centers, especially those with strong walls or strategic importance, occupation continued in contracted form. Yet the civic ambition of Roman town life was fading. Public squares no longer pulsed with official business. Monuments remained, but the institutions they had embodied lost coherence. A basilica without judges, clerks, and petitioners becomes something ghostly. A market space without long-distance trade turns local, improvised, diminished. Archaeological traces suggest that some urban populations clustered into smaller zones, perhaps near defensible points, water sources, or buildings still structurally sound. Life went on, but the city ceased to function as a city in the Roman sense. It became a collection of inhabited patches in a field of monumental memory. For those living among these ruins, the effect must have been profound. Stone architecture carries a moral force. It suggests permanence. It teaches hierarchy. Roman Britain had been filled with such lessons: walls, baths, temples, roads, and villas had all told the same story. That order could be built, measured, and renewed. When these structures decayed, they taught a new lesson. They showed that greatness could fail. Imagine a child born around the middle of the 5th century, playing in the shadow of a fallen bathhouse. hearing elders speak of warm pools, painted walls, and crowded town life that no longer existed. The child would inherit not the living institution, but the broken symbol. That difference shapes imagination. It turns history into longing. The language of ruin also became political. A leader who could occupy an old Roman site might claim continuity with the vanished order. To hold a fortified town, a villa complex, or a former administrative center was to wrap oneself in borrowed authority. Roman stone could lend legitimacy even after Roman government had gone. This may help explain why certain places retained importance despite overall contraction. Ruins were not only practical resources, they were statements. They linked present ambition to remembered greatness. A local ruler seated in a hall built from salvaged Roman material could present himself as both heir and survivor. At the same time, ruins had practical uses that no one in a dangerous age could ignore. Dressed stone was valuable. Brick could be reused. Walls could provide ready-made enclosures. Roads still offered the best routes through difficult country, even when no imperial engineers remained to maintain them. Wells, drains, and foundations created opportunities for new settlement. In this sense, Roman Britain continued to shape the post-Roman world not through active power, but through material afterlife. The empire lingered in infrastructure, even as its political unity dissolved. Its physical remnants guided movement, habitation, defense, and prestige. Yet the ghost of Rome could not feed the hungry or stop the raider. This is why the archaeological record feels so mournful. Grandeur persisted as shell, while vulnerability deepened beneath it. Some of the strongest visual remains belonged to a society no longer capable of reproducing itself. The contrast between stone and instability lies at the heart of this age. A person could walk on a Roman road and still be living in a land of fear. He could pray in a church shaped by Roman Christianity while depending on a local war leader for survival. He could pass broken mosaics underfoot while hearing of fresh attacks on the coast. The old world remained visible, but its guarantees had drained away. The ruins also altered memory in another way. They made Rome seem larger in retrospect. A functioning empire can be resented. A fallen empire can be romanticized. As buildings decayed and material sophistication became harder to sustain, the past may have appeared more coherent, more ordered, more golden than it had felt at the time. This does not mean people forgot Roman taxation, coercion, or hierarchy. It means that in an age of insecurity, remembered structure can become precious. The very brokenness of the ruins sharpened the outline of what had been lost. This is why the stones matter so much in telling the story of Britain after Rome. They are not scenery. They are actors in the drama. They preserve continuity, advertise loss, provide resources, and inspire claims to legitimacy. They remind us that collapse is rarely clean. Worlds overlap. One age inhabits the shell of another. In Britain, the brutal war that would shape the island grew not upon empty ground, but among roads, walls, villas, and bathhouses built by a departed power. Men fought over fields edged by Roman ditches. Communities sought refuge behind old masonry. Children grew up among fragments of empire and came to understand that the land still carried the weight of something immense. The stones endured, but their meaning had changed. They no longer announced that Rome ruled here. They announced that Rome had ruled here, and that those left behind would have to decide, amid ruin and pressure, what kind of world could rise from its remains. Across the narrow waters of the North Sea, another world was stirring, and Britain, weakened, visible, and no longer securely held within imperial discipline, drew its attention like exposed grain draws birds. The men who came from those opposite shores did not arrive from a single kingdom or under one banner of destiny. They came from a fractured and energetic coastal world of estuaries, marshlands, farms, warrior followings, and timber halls. Later tradition would call them Saxons, Angles, Jutes, and by other names besides. Those names matter, but they can also mislead. They suggest fixed peoples moving in neat blocks, when the reality was almost certainly looser, harder, and more human. The sea gathered ambitious men. It mixed raiders, mercenaries, settlers, and exiles. Britain did not face an orderly invasion at first. It faced arrivals. The societies across the sea had their own long histories, shaped by kinship, personal loyalty, feasting culture, warfare, and local competition. Leadership depended heavily on reputation. A chieftain needed followers. Followers needed reward, silver, weapons, land, cattle, and prestige all helped bind a warband together. In such a world, opportunity mattered greatly. A strong leader could attract men by promising gain. A weak land across the water could become a magnet. Britain, with its fertile lowlands, abandoned Roman infrastructure, and growing military weakness, offered exactly the kind of prize that might tempt men who lived in harsher or more crowded conditions. Not every newcomer came in search of a kingdom. Some likely came for booty, some for service, some for refuge, some because kin networks had already begun to stretch across the water. But all stepped into a land where the balance of power was shifting. The boats themselves were part of the story. These were not fleets in the later medieval sense, not towering machines of state, but lighter vessels adapted for coastal movement, estuary travel, and short crossings. They allowed men to strike where resistance was weak, withdraw when necessary, and return again when conditions improved. The sea was not a barrier to them. It was a field of movement. To a British community living near an eastern inlet, danger did not have to march across a frontier. It could appear with the tide. That made defense extraordinarily difficult. One could fortify a town or a hilltop, but one could not seal an entire coastline. Britain's openness became its wound. At first, many of these newcomers may have been viewed not purely as enemies, but as useful force. This is one of the bleak ironies of the age. The Roman world had long employed barbarian soldiers in imperial service. Federate arrangements, military contracts, and hired protection were nothing new in late antiquity. A British leader facing raids from the north or attacks from rival districts may well have thought it practical to employ seaborne fighters from across the water. Such men brought skill, aggression, and immediate military value. In a time of fractured authority, the promise of hard fighters could outweigh distant fears about long-term consequences. The choice was understandable. It may also have been catastrophic. Archaeology helps us glimpse the growing presence of these new groups, though never with complete simplicity. Burial practices begin to change in parts of eastern and southern Britain. Grave goods associated with Northern European material culture appear more frequently. Brooches, weapons, pottery styles, and ornaments suggest new fashions, new identities, or at least new associations. Cemeteries reveal not just individuals, but communities taking shape. Some graves contain clear signals of status and warrior identity. Others suggest family life and stable settlement. This matters deeply. Raiding leaves fear. Settlement leaves roots. Once women, children, and household objects appear in the record in meaningful numbers. we are no longer looking only at war bands passing through. We are seeing the planting of a new society. Genomic data and isotopic analysis have added further layers to this picture. In some regions, particularly in parts of eastern England, there is strong evidence for substantial migration from continental northern Europe during the post-Roman centuries. Yet even here the story resists simplicity. Migration was not uniform everywhere. Some regions show stronger signals than others. Some communities appear more mixed. Intermarriage, cultural blending, and gradual assimilation complicate any image of total replacement. Still, in many of the lowland zones most exposed to North Sea movement, the newcomers became more than temporary visitors. They became part of the human landscape, and in some places they came to dominate it. One should not imagine this process as peaceful simply because it was gradual. Settlement under conditions of weak authority is often violent, even when the archaeology looks quiet. Land has to be held. Existing populations must be displaced, subordinated, absorbed, or bargained with. Local leaders must choose whether to resist, collaborate, or retreat. Every new farmstead established by outsiders represents a political fact on the ground. Every defended hall raised near a river crossing declares an intention to stay. There may have been treaties, marriages, and negotiated coexistence in some districts. There were almost certainly also burnings, seizures, kidnappings, reprisals, and killings that left few written traces. Much of the brutality of this age lives not in chronicles, but in the silence between material clues. The newcomers also brought their own sacred world. Before Christian conversion reshaped them in later centuries, many of these groups practiced polytheistic religions rooted in ancestral custom, sacred sites, seasonal rites, and warrior values. Their burial traditions, with grave goods and symbolic objects, expressed a worldview different from that of Christian Britons. This was not merely a military or demographic change, it was a cultural and spiritual one. Landscapes were being inhabited by people who named gods differently, marked status differently, and imagined honor through different rituals. The island was becoming more than contested. It was becoming plural in dangerous ways. Language, too, began to move with people. Spoken habits travel quickly through households, service, labor, and power. A mercenary band can preserve its tongue for a generation. A settled farming community can spread it far more deeply. Once newcomers held land, raised children, and established local authority, their speech could shape whole regions. This transformation would not be immediate, but the first seeds were planted here, in estuaries, villages, halls, and burial grounds. Britain was listening to new sounds. What makes the arrival of these groups so historically powerful is that they entered a country still haunted by Rome, but no longer protected by it. They did not conquer a functioning province at its height. They entered a fractured inheritance. In some places they were invited. In others, feared. In others, perhaps barely distinguished at first from the many other hard-edged peoples moving through the late antique world. But they stayed. That is the turning point. Britain did not simply suffer raids from across the sea. It began to absorb populations from across the sea, and those populations, through force, opportunity, and persistence, helped transform the island into something the Roman governors would scarcely have recognized. The Saxons and their kindred did not yet know that later centuries would wrap them in origin myths and royal genealogies. The people watching their sails from British shores did not know that these arrivals would help shape the foundations of England. What existed in that moment was more immediate. Hungry men, armed men, families seeking land, local rulers making desperate bargains, cemeteries filling with unfamiliar objects. Lowland districts learning that the sea no longer merely threatened from afar. It delivered new claimants to the land itself. The old province of Britannia was no longer simply falling apart. It was being entered, claimed, and rewritten by people whose future on the island had only just begun. To understand the next stage of Britain's transformation, we have to linger on one of late antiquity's most dangerous habits, the hiring of outside fighters to solve internal weakness. This was not a strange or uniquely British decision. The Roman world had long relied on federate troops, allied peoples, and contracted war bands, frontier defense, civil wars, and regional emergencies had taught imperial and post-imperial leaders alike that armed outsiders could be useful. They arrived quickly. They fought hard. They came with their own commanders and demanded practical reward rather than abstract loyalty. In moments of fear, such arrangements could feel almost rational, yet they carried within them a permanent risk. Men invited to defend a land could also study its softness, learn its roads, count its stores, and decide that payment in coin or food was less attractive than payment in land. Britain in the 5th century was precisely the kind of place where such bargains would flourish. The island faced pressure from multiple directions. Coastal districts were vulnerable to seaborne raiders. Northern regions still feared attacks from beyond the old imperial frontier. Local rulers struggled with rivals nearby, even as threats gathered from farther away. A leader with too few dependable warriors might look across the sea and see not future conquerors, but immediate muscle. A contract could be made. Food could be promised. Land could be granted temporarily. Prestige might even be gained by commanding fierce men whose reputation for battle had already spread along the coasts. In the narrow logic of the moment, this could seem like prudence. Later tradition would remember such decisions with bitterness. Stories survive of foreign fighters summoned to protect Britain, only to turn against those who hired them. The details in these accounts are shaped by memory, rhetoric, and hindsight, yet their core emotional truth rings strongly. In a fractured land, dependence on mercenaries could become an open wound. Once armed outsiders established themselves inside the island, their leverage grew. They knew the terrain. They learned who among the Britons was strong and who was weak. They discovered where grain was stored, where rivers could be crossed, where defenses were neglected, and which districts might be isolated from support. Knowledge is its own kind of weapon. Service made that weapon sharper. This is why betrayal in such a setting would not necessarily have begun with one dramatic declaration. It could emerge through pressure. More food demanded after poor harvests. More land requested for families or followers. Quarrels over payment. Insults at feasts. Retaliation for some local dispute. Raids conducted not by distant strangers, but by men who had yesterday been allies. A hired war band is never only a tool. It is a political body with its own hunger, honor, and future. If its leader senses weakness in his employer, he may cease to think like a servant and begin to think like a claimant. What had been a contract turns into a foothold. Archaeology cannot always isolate the exact moment of such reversals, but it can show their consequences. In some regions, the appearance of continental-style material culture is followed by stronger signs of established settlement and social reproduction. Cemeteries expand. Weapon-rich burials become more common. Farmsteads and local centers align increasingly with the cultural signatures of incoming groups. This does not prove that every shift began in treachery. But it does fit a broader picture in which temporary military presence becomes permanent possession. The hired sword lays down roots. The camp becomes a hall. The hall becomes the center of a district. For the Britons, such a transformation would have been especially cruel because it turned proximity into danger. A raider from across the sea comes, burns, and departs. A Federate force quartered nearby is more intimate. Its members can watch. They can judge local divisions. They can cultivate friendships with some communities and terrify others. They may intermarry, trade, feast, and threaten all at once. The line between guest and occupier becomes frighteningly thin. This would have created a climate of deep mistrust. Every local ruler forced to bargain with outside warriors had to wonder whether he was preserving his district or preparing its conquest. The social cost of this system was enormous. Payment for fighters had to come from somewhere. Grain, livestock, labor, land rights, and prestige goods all flowed toward men whose loyalty could not be assumed beyond immediate advantage. Communities already strained by raids and weakened trade now had to sustain armed groups whose presence was both protection and threat. Such conditions can hollow out a society from within. Villages burdened by provisioning troops become poorer. Local elites who enrich their military clients alienate their own dependents. Rival rulers may each seek mercenary support, escalating conflict across whole regions. The practice multiplies insecurity even when it is meant to contain it. There is also a psychological dimension that should not be overlooked. Britain after Rome was a land trying to preserve inherited forms of order while living under new kinds of pressure. To rely on outsiders for defense was an admission that local power alone was insufficient. That admission weakens confidence. It tells allies that you are vulnerable. It tells enemies that your line is thin. It tells the mercenaries themselves that the land needs them. Once men know they are needed, they begin to raise the price of their need. In that sense, betrayal is not an accident at the edge of the system. It is one of the likely outcomes built into the arrangement from the beginning. Yet these choices should not be judged too easily by those who know what came later. A British leader in immediate danger had no view of the whole future. He saw hungry fighters offshore, enemies nearby, and perhaps only a handful of dependable retainers at his side. If hired warriors could secure a coastline, suppress a rival, or repel a northern raid, the temptation would be immense. Crisis narrows vision. Men choose survival first and calculate consequences later. Much of history turns on such compressed decisions. The people who made them are often remembered either as fools or villains, but they were frequently simply trapped. Still, the consequences were real. Once outside, war bands gained secure positions within Britain. The balance began to tilt. They no longer depended fully on British patrons. They could recruit more followers from across the sea. They could seize resources directly. They could bargain from strength or refuse to bargain at all. Their children could grow up on British soil and yet belong culturally to another world. This is the moment when service shades into settlement, and settlement into domination. The old Roman habit of using barbarians at the edge of empire now returned in a harsher form inside a fallen province. The brutality of the age deepened accordingly. Conflict became less about warding off brief attack and more about competing claims to land, labor, and permanence. A Federate force that turns predatory is more dangerous than a passing raider because it has local knowledge, strategic patience, and often a ready-made excuse. It can say it was denied payment. It can claim offense. It can present expansion as self-defense. Such justifications matter because they help armed groups imagine themselves not as thieves, but as rightful possessors. Violence then grows colder. It is no longer only the violence of sudden plunder. It becomes the violence of replacement. This was one of the great fatal bargains of post-Roman Britain. In trying to defend a fractured country, local rulers may have accelerated its transformation. Men invited in for war did not always leave when the fighting ended. They brought their ambitions ashore with their shields. They learned the land. They planted stakes in it. They discovered that a province abandoned by Rome could still be rich enough to take. And so the island entered a new phase of struggle, not merely resisting outsiders at its edges, but facing the hard truth that some of those outsiders were now inside, armed, established, and increasingly ready to claim Britain not as a battlefield, but as home. The fire did not spread evenly across Britain. It moved by corridor, by weakness, by opportunity, by the grim logic of where men could land, ride, and strike before a response formed. In some places, communities may have lived for years in anxious continuity, hearing rumors of violence elsewhere while their own fields still yielded grain and their own halls still held feast days. In other places, the war arrived with brutal speed. A shoreline settlement might wake to smoke and shouting. A river village might see armed men emerging from mist at dawn. A district that had trusted in an alliance might discover, too late, that its supposed defenders had become predators. The age of local fear was becoming an age of open burning. Archaeology offers only scattered glimpses of that violence, but the pattern it suggests is chilling. In a number of post-Roman contexts, burned structures, abandoned settlements, hastily fortified positions, and disrupted occupation hint at episodes of severe insecurity. We must be careful. Fire in the ground does not always mean massacre. Buildings burn by accident, by neglect, by ritual clearance, or by later reuse. Yet when burn layers appear alongside wider signs of contraction, displacement, and military stress, they begin to speak with greater force. Britain in the 5th century was not merely decaying. In key regions, it was being fought over with enough intensity to alter where and how people dared to live. What would such violence have felt like for ordinary people? That question matters, because history can too easily drift upward toward leaders and battles, forgetting the households that bore the cost. A raiding party did not have to kill everyone to destroy a community. It only had to burn stored grain, drive off cattle, seize tools, kill or carry off a few key people, and leave the survivors facing winter with empty hands. The economics of fear are cruel. A single attack in summer can become famine in winter. The loss of oxen can cripple plowing for the following season. The death of one head of household can leave a family exposed to hunger, dependence, or forced flight. Violence echoes. It does not end when the attackers vanish over the ridge or back across the tide. Refugees must have become part of the landscape. Families from exposed lowlands may have moved inland. Dependents may have crowded into the compounds of stronger lords. People may have retreated toward old hill forts, walled towns, church precincts, or defensible river bends. Such movement leaves only faint traces in many cases, but it is one of the most likely human responses to repeated attack. A countryside under pressure does not simply lose life. It redistributes it. Safer places become denser and more strained. Food stores are shared more thinly. Disease spreads more easily. Old local tensions sharpen as newcomers arrive in need. Even those who escape the sword do not escape the war. Hill forts are especially evocative in this period. Many had ancient origins. their earthworks and heights belonging to a far older Britain that Rome had once overshadowed. In the post-Roman world, some appear to regain significance. Not all were continuously occupied, and not all were purely military, but their renewed use suggests a society rediscovering the defensive value of elevation, enclosure, and memory. A hill fort can be more than a refuge. It can be a statement that authority has retreated from the planned stone town to the defended height. It can gather people, livestock, stores, and leadership under one watchful skyline. To return to such places is to admit that the wide-open country no longer feels safe. The violence also changed the social meaning of manhood and leadership. In peaceful or merely ordered times, status can rest on landholding, office, literacy, and patronage. In a landscape of burning farms and shaken loyalties, the man who can gather fighters, build palisades, scout roads, and retaliate quickly becomes indispensable. War compresses values. It rewards decisiveness, physical courage, and the ability to command loyalty under fear. This does not mean that every local lord became noble in the face of danger. Some surely exploited the chaos, extracting more labor and goods in exchange for protection only partly given. But it does mean that political life was being hammered into a sharper, more martial shape. Revenge likely played a major role in sustaining the conflict. In societies where kinship, honor, and memory carried great weight, one killing did not remain one killing. One burned homestead could call forth a retaliatory raid. One betrayal at a feast could poison relations for a generation. Violence in such a setting is rarely tidy. It spreads through obligation. A son avenges a father. An ally answers an insult. A patron must prove that those under his protection are not struck with impunity. This helps explain why post-Roman war could feel both fragmented and relentless. It was fought not only for land in the abstract, but for household survival, local prestige, and remembered wrongs. The landscape itself shaped the way destruction moved. Dense forests, marshes, and broken country could shelter those fleeing attack, but they could also isolate communities from one another. Rivers enabled movement for traders and raiders alike. Roman roads, still serviceable in many places, gave armed groups fast lines of approach. Open lowlands were productive but exposed. Defensible uplands offered safety, but not always abundance. Every community had to balance fertility against security. The brutal pressure of the age forced choices that would have seemed unthinkable under stable provincial rule. Better to abandon rich but vulnerable land than to die defending it. Better to cluster behind earthworks than to farm scattered plots in easy reach of the enemy. Better to swear loyalty to a hard protector than to stand alone with remembered freedoms. This is also where the emotional climate of the age darkens most sharply. When violence becomes recurrent, people stop imagining peace as normal. Children grow up learning where to hide. Women learn which goods can be grabbed quickly in flight. Men sleep with weapons near at hand. The smell of smoke carries new meanings. Dogs barking at night tighten every chest. A rider on the horizon cannot be assumed friendly. Such habits reshape a society from within. Even when the fields are green and the weather kind, trust has been broken. Britain in these years was learning to live with that broken trust. Yet amid the burnings, communities also adapted. Defenses improved. Alliances hardened. The need for stronger coordination became clearer. The repeated shock of attack forced some British leaders to think beyond household rivalry and local resentment. The war was teaching hard lessons. A scattered people could be picked apart. A region divided by pride or petty quarrel could be entered. exploited, and subdued. To resist effectively required something more disciplined, more organized, more enduring than panic. Out of devastation, the first rough shape of broader resistance began to emerge. That is why the fire at the edge matters so much. It was not simply destruction for its own sake. It was the furnace in which post-Roman Britain began to understand the scale of the crisis facing it. Burned fields, refugee movement, hilltop refugees, retaliatory raids, and the rise of war-centered leadership all formed part of the same transformation. The old province was no longer only declining, it was being tested in blood. Communities that survived did so by changing, hardening, and learning that the war would not be ended by memory alone. Stone ruins could remind them of Rome. Smoke reminded them of the present, and the present was merciless. Out of the wreckage, one name rises with unusual force, not because it is fully illuminated, but because it stands where the darkness briefly thins. Ambrosius Aurelianis. The surviving sources say little, and what they say arrives through later voices shaped by their own purposes. Yet even so, his presence feels different. He is not remembered as a raider, not as a wandering mercenary, not as a petty local strongman feeding on collapse. He appears instead as a figure of restoration, a man associated with discipline, resistance, and the slow recovery of British will after repeated disaster. In an age crowded with loss, that alone was enough to mark him. The tradition places him among the survivors of high status, a man descended from parents who had worn the purple, or at least from a family tied closely enough to Roman authority for later writers to express the connection in those terms. Whether that claim is literally true matters less than what it reveals. Ambrosius was remembered as belonging to the old world of rank and order. He stood, in memory, as a bridge between Roman Britain and the brutal new age into which the island had fallen. That symbolism is powerful. A people living among ruins would naturally invest hope in a leader who seemed to carry something of the vanished empire within himself, not as nostalgia alone, but as practical command. To understand why such a figure mattered, one must imagine the condition of Britain by this point. Repeated attacks had broken confidence. Local rulers had fought, bargained, failed, and sometimes betrayed one another. Outside groups had moved from raiding into settlement. Families had fled exposed districts. Fields had burned. Communities had learned to survive. But survival is not the same as victory. What Britain lacked was not courage in the abstract. It lacked coordination. The war had taught painful lessons. Scattered resistance could wound an enemy. It could not easily reverse the tide. For that, a different kind of leadership was needed, one capable of imposing direction on men exhausted by fear and habitually narrowed by local loyalty. This is where Ambrosius enters with such significance. He seems to belong to that rare class of leaders who can turn defense into strategy. The difference is enormous. A frightened district can gather men to repel an immediate raid. A true war leader can think in seasons, campaigns, and wider alliances. He can move from reacting to shaping. If Ambrosius did what memory suggests, then he did more than win isolated clashes. He helped teach the Britons that they could still act as something larger than a scattering of vulnerable communities. In the shadow of Rome's disappearance, that lesson would have felt almost miraculous. The image of him is likely sharpened by contrast. Across much of the island, leadership had become local, improvised, and martial in a narrow sense. Men ruled where they could defend. Their power often extended little farther than their retainers could ride. Ambrosius, by contrast, is remembered as possessing stature. That word matters. Stature is not merely size of force. It is gravity. It is the ability to make others believe that resistance has a future. In times of collapse, morale is a form of infrastructure. When people cease to believe in coordinated survival, they stop investing in it. They hoard for themselves, withdraw behind local loyalties, and let the wider land go piece by piece. A leader like Ambrosius would have had to reverse that inward drift. There is also the matter of military culture. Rome had left Britain roads, walls, towns, and memory. It may also have left behind fragments of training, organization, and tactical instinct. Men who had served in late Roman structures or grown up near them would not have forgotten everything once imperial pay stopped. Ambrosius may have drawn upon these surviving habits, using them to shape rougher post-Roman forces into something more cohesive. This would not have meant marching legions in full old-style perfection. That world was gone. But discipline can survive beyond empire. A commander who could steady a line, choose ground carefully, organize scouts, and hold allied groups together in battle would already stand above most rivals in such an age. His rise also suggests the growing recognition that the war had become existential. This was no longer a matter of isolated coastal plunder or temporary unrest. Entire districts were changing hands. Cultural transformation was advancing with military pressure. Land once ruled by British elites was slipping toward new claimants with different languages, burial customs, and loyalties. In that setting, leadership acquired historical weight. Men no longer fought only for stores, cattle, or local honor. They fought for whether their people would remain the shaping presence in the land at all. Ambrosius appears at the moment when such awareness begins to harden. The emotional power of his memory may lie partly in this. He represents not the confidence of a secure civilization, but the dignity of a wounded one refusing to die. There is a difference between conquest and endurance. Conquest expands. Endurance holds. The Britons under leaders like Ambrosius were not building a fresh empire. They were trying to prevent total erasure. That makes the struggle feel intimate and severe. Every victory mattered because it bought time. Every failure mattered because retreat could mean not just loss of territory, but the narrowing of an entire culture's future. Around such a figure, others would have gathered. Lesser rulers, household warriors, churchmen seeking protection, refugees desperate for stability, men too young to remember Rome clearly, and men old enough to remember it painfully. A successful resistance leader does not stand alone for long. He becomes a magnet for both hope and grievance. Allies expect protection. Rivals fear loss of influence. Followers demand reward. Victory breeds pressure as well as admiration. If Ambrosius truly played the role later memory grants him, he would have had to manage not only enemies across the battlefield, but tensions within the fragile coalition that resistance required. This is why his story cannot be reduced to a single heroic gesture. His significance lies in the kind of order he seems to represent. Not peace, because the age had no peace to give. Not restored empire, because that was beyond recall. But order enough to fight intelligently. Order enough to hold men together under strain. Order enough to make Britain feel, however briefly and imperfectly, less like a shattered inheritance and more like a cause. In an era when so much was breaking into local fragments, that was revolutionary. The land itself would have shaped his campaigns. Roman roads still offered movement where they survived. Old strongholds could be reoccupied. River crossings mattered. High ground mattered. Supply mattered even more. A leader fighting prolonged resistance in post-Roman Britain needed not only brave men, but grain livestock, and cooperation from civilians already pressed close to hunger. Every campaign rested on a social base. Every victory required communities willing to feed fighters and endure reprisals. If Ambrosius achieved repeated success, then he did so not by charisma alone, but by tapping into a broader British capacity for endurance that had not yet been extinguished by fire and loss. And perhaps that is why his name endured at all. So many others vanished into the soil, their halls burned, their bones weathered, their stories dissolved. Ambrosius remains because he answered a need larger than himself. He gave later memory a shape for resistance. A man onto whom a wounded people could fasten the idea that collapse was not the same as surrender. In the long twilight after Rome, when the island seemed in danger of being broken and rewritten by every incoming tide, his figure stood like a surviving column amid ruin, damaged perhaps, incomplete certainly, but upright enough to tell those around him that the struggle for Britain was not yet lost. The struggle for Britain was not decided in one place, nor in one season, nor by one famous clash suddenly lifting the island out of danger. It unfolded across hills, roads, valleys, river crossings, and stretches of cultivated land that fed armies only so long as armies could protect them. The battles that mattered most were often not the largest in numbers, but the most decisive in consequence. A defended ridge could preserve a district. A lost ford could open a whole region. A broken line of retreat could turn a setback into a disaster. In post-Roman Britain, warfare was intimate with geography. Men fought not across abstract maps, but in landscapes whose every contour could shape whether their people survived another year. One must imagine the island as a patchwork of contested zones. Lowland regions in the east and southeast, more accessible from the sea and easier to settle, were especially vulnerable to incoming groups. Interior territories, upland edges, and western districts offered greater defensibility, but also came with their own hardships. A British leader trying to resist expansion had to think constantly in terms of movement and bottlenecks. Roman roads, where still usable, provided speed but also exposed forces to ambush if scouts failed. Dense woodland could conceal small bodies of men. Marshes could protect flanks or trap the unwary. River crossings became strategic prizes because they turned water from barrier into passage. In a fractured land, control of such points could mean control of whole patterns of war. The nature of armies had changed with the times. The legions of old imperial order were gone. What remained were war bands, local levies, retainers bound to leaders by loyalty and reward. Perhaps some remnants of men trained in more disciplined Roman habits, and fighters hardened by years of insecurity. Such forces could be formidable, but they were less standardized and more dependent on personal leadership. A commander's presence mattered immensely. If he faltered, men might scatter. If he stood, chose ground well, and gave confidence, they might hold far longer than an enemy expected. In such warfare, morale was almost physical. It moved through a line like weather. Weapons, too, reflected the age. Spears were common and practical, useful both for throwing and thrusting. Shields mattered greatly, not only as protection, but as the visible shape of cohesion in a fight. Swords were prized, but not universal. Armor varied by status and wealth. Helmets were valuable pieces of equipment, not guaranteed to every fighter. Battle, therefore, retained a raw closeness. Men saw one another's faces. They smelled sweat, wet leather, mud, and blood. They heard commands shouted over the clash of wood and metal. A broken shield wall could expose bodies in seconds. A slight rise in terrain could change the angle of spear thrusts and the momentum of a charge. War was decided by human endurance at painfully short range. For the Britons, survival depended on more than bravery. It required the ability to stop fragmentation on the field. Local loyalties could enrich a force with passion, but they could also weaken it if each contingent thought first of its own leader or district. A battle line composed of men from different regions, different households, perhaps even different political agendas, needed cohesion under strain. This is where commanders like Ambrosius, or others of similar quality, become so important. The problem was never only gathering enough bodies, it was persuading those bodies to stand together when the moment of collision came. In a world where so much had dissolved, unity in battle became a rare and precious achievement. The British likely sought advantage where discipline and terrain could blunt the strengths of their enemies. Incoming warrior groups, especially those pushing through lowland areas, may have relied heavily on aggressive advance, local mobility, and the confidence that came from repeated success. To stop them, British forces would need to deny easy movement, hold elevated ground, and force battle under conditions that favored defense: a ridgeline, a narrow pass, a riverbank approached through broken ground. These were not merely features of the land. They were arguments made in earth. They said to the enemy that numbers, ferocity, and momentum would not be enough here. Campaigning also involved endurance beyond the battlefield itself. Armies needed food, and food came from civilians already living close to instability. Leaders who moved men constantly without securing supply risked starving their own cause. A successful resistance had to be rooted in communities willing and able to support it. That made every battle part military and part social. A district that trusted its defenders might surrender grain, labor, and sons. A district that doubted them might hold back, flee, or seek private arrangements with whoever seemed likely to prevail. Winning a battle, therefore, meant more than driving off an enemy. It meant convincing the surrounding population that resistance still had meaning. There must have been many clashes that no source remembered by name. Small engagements at crossings, ambushes near woodland tracks, defensive stands outside stockaded enclosures, night attacks on camps, pursuits that dissolved in boggy ground, retaliatory raids against settlements suspected of aiding one side or the other. War at this scale can feel invisible to later history, yet it shapes the larger result. The line between battle and raid was often thin. An action intended to seize cattle might provoke a wider fight. A skirmish between scouts might reveal an army's position. A local victory might persuade hesitant neighbors to join a coalition. Britain's future was being decided not only in grand moments, but in accumulated contests of fear, skill, and persistence. One should also remember the emotional burden of constant readiness. A leader preparing for battle in this world had no guarantee that victory would end the crisis. Even a successful defense might only postpone the next advance. Men fought while knowing that their homes remained vulnerable elsewhere, that their families might be hungry, that allies could fail to arrive, that mercenaries might change sides, that rival British leaders might hold back for private advantage. The strain of uncertainty must have been immense, yet armies still formed, lines still held. That fact alone speaks to the depth of British resistance in these years. A society under such pressure did not cease to fight. It learned to do so under conditions that would have broken many others. As the war lengthened, experience itself became a weapon. Men who survived one season of fighting carried lessons into the next. They learned where enemies preferred to move, how quickly certain groups could gather, what landscapes favored ambush, which local rulers were dependable, and how rumors spread ahead of advancing forces. Such knowledge cannot replace numbers or arms, but it sharpens every choice. A people repeatedly attacked may become exhausted, but they may also become dangerous in defense. Hard years can strip away illusion and leave behind a colder, more capable form of resistance. This was the battle for survival in its truest sense. Not a single encounter crowned by effortless legend, but a grinding sequence of campaigns in which the Britons fought to prevent the island's lowlands, roads, and fertile corridors from slipping entirely beyond their hold. The stakes were greater than any one ruler's prestige. If the British could not stop expansion somewhere, if they could not create spaces where the advance failed and memory turned into organized defense, then the cultural and political map of Britain would narrow until resistance itself became regional and desperate. Every successful stand bought more than time. It bought possibility, and so the land became a school of harsh instruction. Hills taught patience, roads taught caution, rivers taught timing. Burned farmsteads taught what defeat meant in human terms. The British who stood in these struggles were no longer simply survivors of Rome's fall. They were becoming a war-shaped people in their own right, forged by necessity into a harder understanding of leadership, landscape, and collective endurance. The question before them was no longer whether the old order could be restored in full. It was whether enough could be held, enough could be defended, enough could be won, that Britain would remain more than a memory spoken among ruins. On that question, every battlefield mattered. In the long shadow of this war, one figure waits more restlessly than any other: Arthur. Not yet the crowned king of later romance, not yet the lord of shining courts and enchanted swords, but something smaller, harder, and more dangerous. A possibility, a war leader glimpsed through fog. The reason he matters so much is not that the evidence for him is abundant. It is the opposite. He matters because the age itself seems to ask for someone like him. When a land is broken, when memory of empire still lingers, when repeated violence forces scattered peoples toward desperate cooperation, the imagination begins to search for a name large enough to hold the struggle. Arthur may be that name, or he may be the vessel into which many victories, many leaders, and many longings were later poured. The earliest surviving written traditions do not present a simple, stable Arthur. They do not give us the rich portrait that later centuries would adore. Instead, they offer something more elusive and therefore more historically provocative. A warrior associated with battles, a champion figure, a presence near the hinge between collapse and survival. This is not proof in the modern sense. It is not the clean testimony historians dream of, but neither is it empty. In periods where records are sparse, memory often preserves truth in compressed form. A name can outlive detail. A reputation can remain after circumstances have blurred. Arthur enters history not as certainty, but as pressure on the evidence. One must first understand why later generations would need such a figure. The Britons of the 5th and 6th centuries lived through a shattering transformation. They saw districts lost, alliances strained, sacred landscapes altered, and familiar ground claimed by newcomers with different languages and customs. For those who resisted successfully, even for a time, memory alone may not have been enough. They needed a focal point, a leader who could embody courage, unity, tactical brilliance, and the refusal to vanish. Whether one man fulfilled all of this or several were later fused into one, the cultural need is clear. Arthur answers that need with unusual force. It is tempting to dismiss such a figure because the later legend grew so grand. Yet myth does not always grow from nothing. It often clings to a historical knot, a moment of real pressure where one person, one event, or one lineage becomes the seed of something much larger. In Arthur's case, the knot lies in the age of British resistance itself. If a commander won repeated victories against advancing enemies, if he fought in multiple regions, if he united otherwise competing rulers, then his memory would have been unusually suited to expansion. Songs would exaggerate, storytellers would refine, monks would reinterpret, courts would adorn. But beneath all of that, there may still stand a hard-edged original, a man of battle rather than fantasy. The silence around him is part of the problem and the fascination. We do not possess secure contemporary documents that settle the matter. We do not have a verified grave, an official inscription, or a reliable self-description. Instead, we move through fragments, later chronicles, and traditions shaped long after the fighting itself. That forces caution. But caution does not require indifference. The historian's task is not only to reject what cannot be proved completely. It is also to ask why certain memories endure and what conditions made them believable. Arthur remained compelling because the Britain that followed Rome had produced the kind of crisis in which extraordinary leaders really did matter. Some scholars have imagined Arthur not as a king, but as a dux bellorum, a battle leader, perhaps commanding forces drawn from several British polities. This possibility fits the age remarkably well. The 5th and 6th centuries were not yet the age of stable, centralized kingdoms in the later medieval sense. They were an era of coalitions, regional powers, and temporary concentrations of authority forged under pressure. A man could wield immense military importance without ruling as a formal monarch over an entire country. In fact, such a role may suit the evidence better. Arthur, if historical, may have been the man called when the stakes rose beyond local rivalry, when war had to be fought not for one valley only, but for a wider British future. There is also a telling roughness to the earliest battlefield associations. This is not initially a courtly hero. He belongs to the world of shield walls, ridge lines, and hard-riding messengers. His fame is tied to combat, not administration. That matters because post-Roman Britain needed battlefield competence above all. A leader in such a landscape did not survive by elegance. He survived by choosing ground, holding coalitions together, striking at the right moment, and convincing exhausted men to stand once more. Later literature polished Arthur into majesty. The age that may have birthed him would have required something more immediate: endurance, ferocity, and command. One may also wonder whether Arthur's later greatness reflects not merely admiration, but grief. Legendary inflation often happens when a people lose something and seek to preserve it in ideal form. If British resistance won famous victories but could not permanently halt the broader transformation of lowland Britain, then memory may have responded by making its champion larger. The more the political reality narrowed, the more expansive the remembered hero could become. A fading culture often enlarges its defenders in retrospect, not necessarily through falsehood, but through emotional necessity. Arthur, then, may be the monument erected by memory where stone itself was lacking. The landscape of Britain encouraged such remembrance. Battlefields in old roads and hills, ruined Roman towns, church communities preserving scraps of learning, Western strongholds holding out against change. All these formed a country suited to heroic memory. People living among remnants of empire and signs of fresh conquest would naturally ask who had stood against the tide, who had held the line, who had made the enemy fear to advance. One name, once attached firmly enough to that question, could become almost impossible to dislodge. Arthur may have become not only a man, but the answer to a wound. Still, honesty is essential. We cannot claim more than the evidence allows. The historical Arthur remains uncertain. He may have existed as a single leader. He may represent several leaders combined. He may stand at the meeting point of history and story in ways that cannot now be cleanly separated. But uncertainty does not make the subject trivial. On the contrary, it reveals how the age itself worked upon memory. Britain after Rome was a land where records were thin, trauma was deep, and heroism mattered because communal survival depended upon it. In such a world, the boundary between remembered commander and legendary savior was always going to be fragile. What can be said with confidence is that the figure of Arthur belongs to the right kind of crisis. He belongs to a Britain where alliances had to be forged under threat, where victory could hold back disaster for a generation, where military leadership carried cultural weight far beyond the battlefield. He belongs to the imagination of a people who had not forgotten Rome, but could no longer rely on Rome, and who therefore invested extraordinary hope in those who could still promise resistance. Whether Arthur was one man or many shadows gathered into one, he stands at the exact place where history becomes legend, because history alone no longer feels sufficient to contain the scale of what was endured. That is why Arthur before legend is so compelling. He is not the end of inquiry, but the beginning of a deeper one. He asks what kind of leader this age would have produced. He asks how memory behaves when records fail. He asks why one name, more than so many others, remained alive while halls fell, graves weathered, and kingdoms changed their speech. Above all, he reminds us that the brutal war which followed Rome did not only shape territory, it shaped imagination. It taught the people of Britain to remember survival in heroic form, and somewhere in that act of remembering, whether as man or myth or both at once, Arthur took his place. If there was a single victory that later memory treated as the great turning of the tide, it was Badon. The name arrives through the sources like a bell heard across distance, clear enough to recognize, impossible to locate with certainty. We do not know its exact field. We do not know with complete confidence who commanded there. We do not even know how one should picture the battle in all its details. Yet for all that uncertainty, Badon stands with unusual weight in the history of post-Roman Britain. It was remembered as a check, a moment when the advance of the newcomers was not merely slowed in some minor district, but halted with enough force that a generation could breathe differently afterward. That alone makes it extraordinary. Most victories in such an age are local and perishable. They save a valley, preserve a harvest, defend a river crossing, and are then swallowed by the next emergency. Badon was remembered on a different scale. The tradition suggests not simply success, but reversal. A British triumph powerful enough to alter the rhythm of the war. In a conflict defined by pressure, migration, settlement, and repeated adaptation, to stop momentum mattered as much as winning ground. Momentum is psychological. It moves through rumor before armies arrive. It tells settlers that more land will soon open. It tells local allies to shift loyalty. It tells frightened communities that resistance is hopeless. A battle that breaks such momentum can change history beyond the field itself. We should imagine what the years before such a clash had felt like. District after district tested. Alliances strained. British leaders forced to balance local obligations with wider danger. Incoming groups pushing their luck farther inland, holding more land, building more stable communities, learning the terrain ever more intimately. Against that background, a decisive British victory would have come not as comfort, but as astonishment. It would have proved that advance was not inevitable. It would have shown that coordination, discipline, and leadership could still impose a limit on what seemed to be a widening transformation. It would have given exhausted people something stronger than endurance. It would have given them pause, space, and the dangerous luxury of hope. Where did Badon happen? That question has tempted scholars, antiquarians, and patriots for generations. Was it a hill fort? A fortified height near a road? A strong defensive position controlling movement between key districts? A siege? A pitched battle near a place later forgotten? The uncertainty is frustrating. Yet the range of possibilities tells us something important. The battle was likely remembered less because of a picturesque landscape and more because of its effect. Its fame does not rest on scenic detail, but on consequence. This makes historical sense. People living through prolonged war care less about the elegance of a battlefield than about whether it secures their future. Military logic suggests that if Badon truly checked expansion on a large scale, it may have occurred at a strategic bottleneck or in circumstances where the attackers committed heavily and failed catastrophically. A ridgeline, a hilltop enclosure, a defended approach, or some position that denied easy maneuver would fit the broader patterns of British resistance. If the Britons forced their opponents into an assault uphill, into narrowed frontage, or against prepared defenses, then discipline and terrain together could have magnified their success. One can imagine shield meeting shield on rising ground, spears braced, missiles cast downward, men struggling through mud or rock while their momentum bled away. In such battles, confidence can shatter suddenly. A force that has won repeatedly may panic when it discovers, too late, that this field will not yield as the others did. The identity of the leader at Badon remains equally contested. Later tradition eagerly associates the victory with Arthur, and it is easy to see why. If memory required a champion, then the greatest remembered British victory would naturally attach itself to the greatest remembered British war leader. Yet another figure, such as Ambrosius or someone now lost to name, may also have played the role. It is possible that the historical truth lies in between. A tradition of victories led by one generation of commanders may have narrowed into one symbolic name over time. The sources are too sparse to settle the question, but they are not too sparse to show that leadership mattered profoundly. Badon was not merely luck. It was remembered as the result of organized resistance reaching its highest effectiveness. What followed the battle is perhaps its most remarkable feature. The tradition speaks of a pause, a long interval in which the pace of advance slackened and British communities experienced something closer to stability. One must not imagine perfect peace. Local conflicts, border tensions, and raids surely persisted. This was not a magical restoration of the old Roman province. Yet even relative respite in such an age would have been transformative. Fields could be worked more confidently. Children could grow into adolescence without knowing only flight and smoke. Churches could rebuild their routines. Local rulers could invest in more than emergency defense. Memory itself changes during a pause. A people who have lived at the edge of destruction begin, cautiously, to imagine continuity again. Such a pause would also have allowed British identity to harden in cultural as well as military terms. Resistance is not only about surviving attack, it is about deciding who one is in the act of surviving. Communities that had fought together, prayed together, buried their dead after hard-won battles, and held territory through discipline rather than panic would emerge from victory with a stronger sense of shared cause. This matters because the war after Rome was not simply a contest over land. It was a contest over what kind of Britain would persist. Badon, if understood as a true turning point, gave the Britons time to remain themselves more fully, yet the very greatness of the victory may have carried a hidden sadness. Later generations remembered Badon precisely because the broader transformation of Britain was not permanently undone. If the battle had founded an enduring British supremacy across the whole island, it might have entered the record differently, as the start of a stable new order. Instead, it lives in memory as a magnificent holding action, a triumph that delayed, checked, and reshaped the future without entirely mastering it. There is nobility in that, but also melancholy. The greatest victories of wounded civilizations are often victories of survival, not total restoration. Archaeology cannot point to Badon with a single steady finger, but the broader pattern of the age supports the possibility of such a decisive halt. Expansion was not a simple, uninterrupted wave. It pulsed, stalled, resumed, and changed character by region. That in itself makes room for a major British success of the kind the sources imply. The political map of post-Roman Britain did not settle overnight. Resistance in the west and north remained real. Cultural frontiers remained contested. The memory of a great victory belongs naturally within that landscape of uneven struggle. Badon therefore stands as both event and symbol. As event, it was likely a brutal contest in which British resistance reached one of its highest moments of organization and resolve. As symbol, it became proof that the island's future had not been surrendered without answer. It told later generations that there had been a field, somewhere beneath the changing names of hills and roads, where men stood together and stopped what seemed unstoppable. The place may be uncertain. The commander may be uncertain. The exact shape of the fighting may be uncertain, but the meaning endured. For a generation, perhaps more, the invincible tide faltered. And in that faltering, Britain found time, memory, and the fierce reassurance that even in the darkest century, the future could still be contested and won, if only for a while. While war reshaped Britain in fire and fear, another struggle unfolded more quietly across the land, in prayer, burial, memory, and the naming of sacred space. The island after Rome was not only a battlefield of peoples, it was a battlefield of worlds. Christianity, brought and nurtured under imperial rule, did not vanish when Rome's officials departed. It remained embedded in communities, in bishops and priests, in habits of worship, in small churches, in inherited ideas about the ordering of life, suffering, death, and eternity. Yet now it had to endure in a harsher political landscape, one in which the advancing newcomers often carried other gods, other rites, and another sacred imagination entirely. The struggle for Britain was therefore fought not only with spear and shield, but with bells, graves, feasts, and the meanings attached to the dead. Christian Britain in the 5th and 6th centuries was no longer protected by the institutional power of empire, but it still possessed resilience. The Church had something warlords could not manufacture quickly. It had continuity. It held literacy, moral language, and a memory stretching beyond local catastrophe. A bishop, even in diminished circumstances, represented more than a holy man. He represented an older order of truth. He linked frightened communities to a universal story larger than the collapse around them. In an age where roads decayed and kingdoms broke apart, that kind of continuity mattered. It told people that the world had not become meaningless simply because it had become violent. But Christianity in post-Roman Britain was not immune to fragmentation. Church organization likely became uneven. Some regions retained stronger clerical presence. Others may have depended upon more local and improvised forms of worship. Wealth that had once supported ecclesiastical life was harder to sustain. Communication with the wider Christian world became more difficult. Yet perhaps precisely because of this, the local sacred landscape grew even more important. A church site, a burial ground, a saint's memory, a holy spring, or a monastic enclosure could anchor a district emotionally as much as politically. When everything else seemed uncertain, people clung more fiercely to places where order still felt imaginable. Against this stood the religious traditions of many of the incoming groups. Before conversion altered their world in later generations, these communities brought with them polytheistic beliefs rooted in ancestral custom, sacred objects, seasonal observance, and the honor of warrior lineages. Their rituals did not need churches of stone to hold power. Sacredness could live in groves, halls, burial rites, weapons, feast customs, and remembered descent. That made the cultural collision especially intense. The newcomers were not simply militarily different. They inhabited reality through different sacred assumptions. Their dead were often buried with grave goods. Their status was displayed materially even in death. Their symbols of honor followed them into the earth. Burial practice is one of the clearest archaeological windows into this shifting landscape. Cemeteries associated with continental traditions appear in growing numbers in parts of eastern and southern Britain. Furnished graves, brooches, weapons, beads, pottery, and other goods signal not only style, but worldview. A burial is a final statement about what a community believes matters. Christian burial, in its more ideal form, tended toward restraint, equality before God, and less emphasis on equipping the dead materially. Pagan burial traditions, by contrast, could place visible stress on rank, kinship, gendered adornment, and the social identity of the deceased. When such cemeteries multiply across the landscape, they announce more than migration. They announce the arrival of another sacred order. Yet the boundary between these worlds was not always absolute. Frontiers of faith, like frontiers of language and politics, are often porous on the ground. Intermarriage likely occurred. Servants and dependents moved between households. Captives were taken. Alliances were forged. A British Christian district living near a pagan settler community would not experience religion as a simple abstract opposition. It would encounter it in dress, oath-taking, feast behavior, funeral rites, and the names given to places and children. Tension could be sharp, but so too could borrowing, adaptation, and uneasy coexistence. Religious change rarely advances only by formal conversion. It often advances by daily intimacy. The old sacred landscape of Roman Britain also had a long memory beneath Christianity itself. Many Christian sites were established in places already marked as spiritually potent in earlier times. Springs, heights, crossroads, and former ritual zones could be reinterpreted rather than erased. This means that Britain's religious geography after Rome was layered. Beneath Christian practice lay older native sacred habits. Beside Christianity stood the ancestral cults of incoming groups. Around all of them moved the continuing pressure of war. Such layering gave the age a haunting texture. A ruined Roman town might contain a church preserving fragments of Latin learning, while nearby hills held older memories. And beyond them, new cemeteries gathered with foreign ornaments and weapons in the graves. The emotional power of faith in such a time should not be underestimated. For Christians among the Britons, suffering could be interpreted within a moral and cosmic frame. Disaster might be seen as punishment, testing, or the dark passage before eventual renewal. Clerics could exhort courage, patience, repentance, and solidarity. They could also record grief and anger in ways that preserved the emotional truth of the age. Christianity offered a vocabulary for endurance. That did not make it a passive force. A church community under threat could become a center of resistance, storage, refuge, and identity. Sacred authority and survival were not separate matters in a land where both body and soul seemed under siege. For the newcomers, religion likewise strengthened collective identity. Shared rites, feasts, and burial customs helped migrant and settler groups sustain cohesion in unfamiliar territory. Gods carried across the sea gave continuity to people planting themselves in new land. Ancestral memory helped them imagine their expansion not as mere theft, but as rightful destiny, reward, or fulfillment of kin-based ambition. Faith, in this sense, was not simply private belief. It was part of how communities justified their presence, honored their dead, and imagined their future. This is why the sacred struggle mattered so deeply. It shaped not only how people worshipped, but how they interpreted victory and defeat. A burned church was not merely a damaged building. It was an assault on cosmic order. A cemetery established with unfamiliar rites was not merely new land use. It was a statement that another people now claimed spiritual residence in the landscape. A surviving British Christian enclave holding its burials and liturgy intact amid expanding pressure was making a declaration just as bold. It was saying that memory, faith, and sacred legitimacy had not yet yielded. Over time, these worlds would not remain permanently separate. Conversion, adaptation, and political consolidation would eventually alter the map again. But in the age of struggle itself, faith sharpened identity. Christianity linked many Britons to Rome's moral inheritance even after Rome's armies and officials were gone. Pagan traditions rooted many newcomers in their own sense of honor and belonging. The land became crowded not only with armed men, but with rival meanings: graves, prayers, amulets, relics, feasts, and holy places all helped answer the question of who belonged here, and under whose gods the future would unfold. So when we look across post-Roman Britain, we should not see only ruins and battlefields. We should also see altars in the mind. We should hear hymns in threatened churches, mourning over restrained Christian burials, the clink of grave goods laid beside pagan dead, the solemnity of feast halls where oaths were taken under ancestral protection. The war after Rome was fought in these quiet acts as surely as in open combat. Britain was being divided and remade not only by who held the sword, but by who named the sacred, who buried the dead with confidence, and who could persuade the living that heaven, fate, or the gods still stood with them. War can burn a village in an afternoon, but language changes more slowly, entering through the cradle, the hearth, the market, the oath, and the field boundary. In post-Roman Britain, the clash of peoples was also a clash of tongues. Latin, once the language of administration, law, military order, and elite display did not vanish overnight. Brittonic speech, the living descendant of older native traditions, still filled households, farms, and local communities across much of the island. But now another family of speech was taking root. Old English, carried by settlers from across the North Sea, began its long spread through the lowlands. This transformation did not require a single decree. It advanced through settlement, power, childhood, and the quiet authority of daily life under Roman rule. Latin had carried prestige even where it was not the first spoken language of the countryside. It lived in inscriptions, church practice, elite identity, military communication, and civic administration. Yet its strength depended heavily on institutions. When those institutions weakened, Latin's everyday reach became more fragile. Clerics could preserve it in prayer, scripture, and memory. Some elites could continue to use it as a marker of standing. But the collapse of urban administration and long-distance state communication narrowed the places where Latin could remain socially dominant. A language of empire can endure for centuries when empire lives. Once empire fails, that same language must rely on smaller communities of transmission. Brittonic, by contrast, was rooted more deeply in everyday continuity. It belonged to families, labor, place memory, and oral life. It was the speech of many of the people who remained on the land after Roman withdrawal. One should not imagine the Britons as people who had somehow ceased to speak their own inherited tongues under Rome, and then simply reclaimed them afterward. Linguistic life is seldom so neat. Britain under Rome was almost certainly multilingual in layered ways, with Latin stronger in certain settings, Brittonic stronger in others, and local variation everywhere. After Rome, those layers shifted. Latin receded from practical power. Brittonic endured strongly in many western and northern regions. Yet in the east and southeast, where migration and settlement from across the sea grew most intense, a third current widened rapidly. Old English arrived not merely in the mouths of warriors, but in the mouths of households. That distinction is crucial. A raiding force can frighten a region without changing its language deeply. A settled community can alter speech generation by generation. Once incoming groups established farms, halls, kin networks, and burial grounds. Their language gained a social base. Children learned it first. Servants and dependents heard it daily. Neighbors traded across linguistic boundaries. Local leaders who allied with or submitted to newcomer authority may have found practical advantage in accommodating the new tongue. Language follows power, but it also follows routine. It is the repeated word at the gate, the command in the field, the lullaby, the insult, the marriage bargain, the name spoken for bread, water, and home. Place names offer some of the most lasting clues to this transformation. Across much of what would later become England, the landscape gradually accumulated names derived from Old English speech. Villages, rivers, enclosures, clearings, and farmsteads took on new linguistic clothing. This did not happen in a day, nor did it erase all earlier names. Ancient names often endure stubbornly, especially for major rivers, hills, and regions. But the layering matters. A land once named through Brittonic or Latin habits begins to show another pattern. To rename a place is to settle it in the imagination. It is a form of possession quieter than battle, and often more enduring. This does not mean that Brittonic speech simply vanished wherever Old English spread. Frontiers of language are rarely clean. For generations, perhaps centuries in some places, bilingual or mixed environments likely existed, Intermarriage, service relationships, and local accommodation would have created zones of overlap. Some Britons may have adopted Old English for practical survival while preserving older speech within the household. Some newcomers may have learned local words for landmarks, crops, or customs. Captives and dependents may have carried one tongue into the households of another people. Yet over time, where political control, landholding, and social prestige increasingly favored the newcomers, language shifted accordingly. Speech can move without everyone moving. It can change because the future begins to sound different from the past. The emotional dimension of this change is easy to miss, but it must have been profound. To hear one's landscape named differently, to watch children speak more comfortably in the language of recent settlers, to realize that authority increasingly answers in another tongue. These are not small losses. Language carries memory, humor, grief, and belonging. When it retreats, more retreats with it than vocabulary alone. For British communities pushed westward or reduced in influence across contested lowlands, linguistic change would have signaled not only demographic pressure, but cultural narrowing. The war was no longer only about who held the fort or field. It was about which words would survive on people's lips. At the same time, for the newcomers, the spread of Old English marked achievement. It meant that settlement had matured beyond mere occupation. A community confident enough to reproduce its language across generations had become more than a military foothold. It had become a society. Speech turned conquest into normality. It made the extraordinary event of migration feel ordinary within daily life. Once a child grows up naming the local stream, path, and pasture in the language of his parents, the land begins to belong to that language's world. What had been foreign becomes home. Latin lingered longest where literacy and church structures survived most strongly. Monasteries, clerical households, and religious communities could preserve the language as a sacred and scholarly medium long after its broader social power declined. This gave Britain a layered linguistic future rather than a simple replacement. Latin remained the language of certain prayers and records. Brittonic remained vibrant in Western strongholds and beyond the zones of deepest Eastern transformation. Old English spread through the lowlands where settlement, political power, and local reproduction favored it. The island became not linguistically empty after Rome, but more contested and regionally differentiated. This linguistic fragmentation mirrored the political one. A shared imperial framework had once given Britain some degree of common reference, however unevenly lived. Now speech itself increasingly reflected divergence. Regions no longer imagined the world through the same sounds. That matters because language shapes allegiance. It shapes law, oral tradition, kin memory, and the transmission of sacred stories. A land that speaks differently in its major regions will, over time, begin to think politically through those differences as well. The making of England, Wales, and other later identities was seeded partly here, in the quiet accumulation of linguistic frontiers. Archaeology alone cannot hear these voices, but it helps us locate the communities where they lived. Cemeteries, settlement patterns, grave goods, and domestic forms point toward zones of migration and cultural persistence. Historical linguistics then joins the work, tracing place names, sound shifts, and word survival across the map. Together, they reveal one of the deepest truths of post-Roman Britain. Conquest is not only measured in burnt timber and lost ground, it is measured in speech, in what parents teach their children, in what a priest preserves, in what a local lord rewards, in what name a plowman uses for the same old field. So the language divide was not a side effect of the war. It was one of its most lasting outcomes. Latin faded from worldly command, but survived in sacred memory. Brittonic held on with tenacity, where British communities remained strongest. Old English advanced with settlements, households, and power. The island, once drawn into imperial unity by roads and officials, was now being redrawn by tongues. One could lose a town in battle and perhaps win it back. To lose a language across a region was another matter. That loss moved more quietly and often more permanently. By the time people noticed its full force, the children were already speaking the future. The dead can tell us things that the living never wrote down. In post-Roman Britain, where chronicles are sparse and memory is uneven, cemeteries become archives of identity. A grave is never only a resting place. It is a statement shaped by the choices of the community that dug it, the hands that laid the body down, and the beliefs that governed what should accompany the dead into silence. Through graves, archaeologists recover not simply bones and objects, but traces of migration, kinship, status, diet, disease, and cultural belonging, in an age where Britain was being contested, settled, and transformed. Burial grounds reveal how that transformation happened not only in battlefields and ruined towns, but in the intimate geography of family and death. Across parts of eastern and southern Britain, early medieval cemeteries have yielded patterns strongly associated with continental North Sea traditions. Furnished burials, in which the dead were laid to rest with brooches, knives, weapons, beads, buckles, pottery, or personal ornaments, appear with striking regularity. These objects matter because they express identity in public form. A sword at the side of a man speaks of status, martial expectation, or remembered service. A brooch pair fastened at the shoulders of a woman can reflect fashion, affiliation, and social place. Beads, combs, and vessels are not random offerings. They belong to a cultural grammar. When such grammar spreads across a landscape, it tells us that newcomer communities were not transient intruders. They were building homes, families, and memory. At first glance, it might seem that these cemeteries give us a simple answer. The newcomers came, buried their dead in recognizable northern styles, and gradually replaced what had been there before. But the truth is more intricate, and therefore more human. Burial evidence rarely maps neatly onto ethnicity in a modern sense. People adopt customs. Families mix. Status can be performed through material style, even when ancestry is more complex. A man buried with objects associated with continental custom may have had one local parent. A woman buried in what looks like a newcomer style may have been born in Britain, but married into a migrant household. The cemetery does not give us slogans. It gives us evidence, and that evidence often points toward blending as well as separation. This is where isotopic and genomic research has transformed understanding. Isotopic analysis of teeth and bones can reveal aspects of where a person spent childhood and how diet changed across a lifetime. Genomic data can show biological relationships and broad patterns of ancestry across populations. Together, these methods have allowed scholars to move beyond older all-or-nothing debates. In some cemeteries, there is clear evidence that many individuals or their close ancestors came from continental Northern Europe. In others, mixed ancestry appears within the same burial community. This is one of the most important discoveries of recent scholarship. The making of early England was neither pure invasion nor simple cultural imitation. It was, in many regions, a process of migration, intermarriage, domination, accommodation, and local adaptation unfolding over generations. Some burial grounds are especially evocative because they show communities living through that mixture in real time. One grave may contain a person whose isotopic signature suggests a childhood across the sea, buried beside another whose life was rooted in Britain. A family cluster may include different material expressions of status. A child's burial may show that by the second generation, cultural identity had already become local even if ancestry remained mixed. In such cases, the cemetery reveals settlement becoming society. The first arrivals are no longer isolated pioneers or war bands. They are grandparents. Their descendants know the land as home. This has profound implications for how we understand the brutal war that followed Rome. Conflict may have opened the door, but once communities rooted themselves, the future of the island was shaped just as much by reproduction as by battle. A people does not transform a landscape only by winning fields. It transforms it by burying children in that soil, by naming plots and streams, by marrying, farming, feasting, and mourning there. Cemeteries show this transition with quiet force. The dead do not argue. They simply remain, in ordered rows or clustered groups, marking the place where presence hardened into belonging. Christian burial adds another layer to the story. In communities where Christian practice remained strong, graves were often less materially furnished, at least in ideal form, and more oriented toward a different kind of sacred statement. The dead were commended to God rather than sent forth with visible wealth. Yet even here, practice could vary. The post-Roman world was messy. Not all Christians followed strict burial ideals at once, and not all furnished burials belonged to people untouched by Christian influence. Borderlands of faith and culture often create hybrid practices. A grave may combine restraint with inherited adornment. A cemetery may show changing habits across only a few generations. This makes burial grounds not static labels, but records of communities negotiating who they were becoming. Kinship also emerges from the earth in striking ways. Some cemeteries appear organized in family clusters, suggesting that memory of descent mattered strongly. Genomic links can sometimes confirm relationships that the arrangement of graves had already hinted at. This matters because it reminds us that migration and settlement were not merely political events. They were family events. The transformation of Britain was carried in wombs, in marriages, in the placing of one dead relative beside another. Political borders can shift quickly. Kin-based settlement endures in deeper ways. Once a family line takes root in a district, the district begins to absorb that family into its future. For the surviving Britons, such developments must have been deeply unsettling in some regions. A furnished cemetery on formerly British land was not only evidence of recent arrivals, it was proof that the newcomers expected continuity. They intended their dead to remain here. Their memory would now inhabit the same ground. This is the kind of transformation that cannot easily be undone. A burned hall can be rebuilt. A battle lost can be avenged. But once another people's ancestors are buried in a valley, the valley itself becomes contested in sacred and emotional terms. Soil thickens with claim. At the same time, many British communities persisted, especially in the West, North, and other regions less thoroughly absorbed into the new lowland order. Their own burial landscapes carried continuity of identity, even if the archaeological signatures are often subtler. The contrast between these zones is important. Britain was not transformed evenly. Some districts became deeply enmeshed in the cultural world of the newcomers. Others held to older languages, religious patterns, and social memory. Cemeteries therefore do not reveal one national story. They reveal multiple regional futures taking shape at once. There is something almost painfully intimate in the way burial evidence forces us to confront change. The broad terms of history, migration, conquest, collapse, adaptation, can feel abstract. A grave is not abstract. It is one body, one set of mourners, one set of choices. Yet when hundreds of such graves are studied together, the scale of transformation becomes unmistakable. The making of post-Roman Britain happened one person at a time, one marriage at a time, one child at a time, one funeral at a time. The dead make visible the slow mathematics of history, so the cemeteries of this age do more than confirm movement across the sea. They uncover the social texture of that movement. They show migrants becoming settlers, settlers becoming kin, and kin becoming the foundation of new political worlds. They show that identity in early Britain was not fixed, but negotiated, performed, inherited, and often shared uneasily across lines of origin. Above all, they remind us that the brutal war after Rome did not only create ruins, it created descendants. And those descendants, buried beneath fields that would one day be called English, Welsh, or by other names still, carried within their bones the memory of a land remade by conflict, mixture, and the long, stubborn work of becoming native to a place once entered as strangers. Out of the ash of raids, failed alliances, and desperate resistance, new political shapes began to emerge. They were not yet the stable kingdoms of later medieval maps, nor were they mere temporary camps of armed opportunists. They were something in between, hard-edged, experimental, and rooted in the realities of land, kinship, violence, and settlement. In the eastern and southern parts of Britain especially, the newcomers were no longer simply war bands moving through vulnerable territory. They were becoming rulers of districts. The brutal war that had first opened the island to them was now giving way to a harsher kind of permanence. Kingdoms were being born. Kent is often placed near the front of this transformation, and not by accident. Its position close to the continent, its access to seaborne routes, and its fertile landscapes made it one of the most natural entry points for settlement from across the Channel and the North Sea. A group established there could maintain contact with homelands, attract further migrants, and consolidate power through both maritime and agricultural advantage. In such a region, a successful elite did not need to conquer the whole island to become formidable. It needed only to control movement, command loyalty, and anchor itself firmly enough that what had begun as a rival turned into inheritance. Kent, in this sense, was less a frontier than a threshold that had already swung open. Sussex presents another face of this emerging order. The very name later associated with it points to the South Saxons, a reminder of how migration and identity could harden into political geography. What began as people became territory. This is one of the most important developments of the age. A group that can attach its own name to a region has crossed from mere presence into authority. Such naming is not symbolic only. It reflects control over land, the ability to reproduce a political community, and enough confidence that the region's future can be imagined in that group's terms. A coastal or lowland district, once known within a British frame, gradually comes to be understood as the possession of another people. The map itself begins to speak a new language. Wessex, though its fuller rise belongs to later centuries, also has roots in this age of formation. The West Saxons, like other emerging groups, did not spring suddenly into being as a ready-made state. They were shaped through accumulation, conflict, alliance, and settlement over time. That process likely involved absorbing smaller polities, pressing against British-held lands, and learning to convert war leadership into more regular forms of kingship. A successful chieftain can win battles. A successful dynasty must do more. It must manage succession, cultivate sacred legitimacy, reward followers consistently, and persuade people that its rule belongs not only to the present emergency, but to the natural future of the land. The move from warband to kingdom is one of history's most delicate transitions, and Britain in the 6th century was full of such experiments. These new polities rested on several foundations. The first was land. A ruler needed fields, pasture, river access, and settlements capable of sustaining both elite households and armed followers. The second was kinship. Early kingdoms were not impersonal bureaucratic machines. They were extensions of powerful lineages, real or constructed, whose claims were strengthened through ancestry, marriage, and remembered conquest. The third was military credibility. In an age still shadowed by insecurity, a ruler who could not defend his territory or punish enemies would lose loyalty quickly. The fourth was symbolic order. Kingship, even in rough early form, needed story. It needed origin. It needed sacred backing, heroic memory, or divine favor. Men fight for a successful leader. They endure under a king whose rule feels woven into the order of things. Archaeology helps us sense this shift from fluid violence to structured authority. Certain sites begin to show signs of elite residence and local centrality. Halls, richer burials, concentrations of high-status goods, and nodal settlements suggest places where power was gathering. These were not yet capitals in the grand later sense, but they were political hearts. Around them moved tribute, feasting, alliance-making, legal settlement, and the display of prestige. A timber hall could do what a ruined Roman basilica no longer could. It could gather living power in the present tense. Within such halls, kingship was not abstract. It was seen in gift-giving, in oaths sworn before witnesses, in retainers seated by rank, and in the visible generosity that bound warriors to their lord. This does not mean the kingdoms emerged peacefully from stabilized settlement. Quite the opposite. Their formation was often an extension of violence into political structure. One district's successful defense became another's subjugation. A leader who had once fought the Britons as an outsider might now fight rival settler groups as a king in the making. The war fragmented and multiplied before it consolidated. Kent did not rise in a vacuum. Sussex did not form in empty land. Wessex did not inherit a blank frontier. Each emerged through encounters with surviving British communities, neighboring migrant groups, and internal contests for supremacy. Kingdom-making is conquest domesticated, turned from raw seizure into durable rule. For the Britons still resisting or enduring within these transforming regions, the rise of such kingdoms marked a grim new stage. Raiding and migration could perhaps be answered with local defense and tactical victories. A settled kingdom posed a deeper challenge. It could collect tribute, hold territory across generations, reward followers with land, and organize expansion more systematically. It could turn memory of arrival into a charter for future conquest. A British community facing such a neighbor was no longer opposing mere intruders. It was facing a state in embryo, a political organism beginning to grow its own institutions, expectations, and appetite. The cultural implications were equally profound. Once kingdoms formed, language spread more securely with authority. Law, custom, and sacred identity could be reinforced from centers of power. Marriage alliances could bind local elites into the new order. Christian communities, where present, would eventually have to negotiate with these rulers, and later conversion would transform many of them further. But in their earlier phase, these kingdoms gave stable shape to cultural change already underway. They made newcomer identity territorial and hereditary. They turned fluid frontiers into recognized spheres of rule. It is important, though, not to imagine a neat sequence in which chaos ends and kingdoms calmly take over. The early kingdoms themselves were unstable, vulnerable, and often brutally maintained. Their rulers depended on personal authority, military success, and the loyalty of men who expected reward. Failure in battle could still destroy a budding polity. A disputed succession could split it. A famine could weaken its grip. Yet instability does not cancel significance. Even fragile kingdoms alter the political imagination. They teach people to think in larger units than the household or local district. They organize expansion. They create genealogies. They remember founders. They attach names to territories in ways that outlast the men who first seized them. This is the deep meaning of the kingdoms from ashes. Britain after Rome did not remain forever a shattered field of isolated communities. In some regions, the pressure of war and settlement generated new centers of power strong enough to endure, however unevenly, beyond one leader's lifetime. These kingdoms were born in hardship, but they were not accidental. They were the political answer produced by a landscape where migration had become settlement, and settlement demanded order. The newcomers had crossed a threshold. They were no longer only arriving on British shores. They were building realms upon them, and that made the future more severe for those who still hoped to preserve a different Britain. A raid can be repelled. A migration can be slowed. A kingdom, once established, must be matched or outlasted. The struggle was therefore changing character again. The land now held rival political worlds side by side, one emerging from the descendants of Rome's Britain, the other from the descendants of those who had come oversea. Between them stood frontiers of language, faith, loyalty, and memory. The brutal war had not ended. It had deepened into state formation, and from that deepening, the foundations of later England were beginning, slowly and grimly, to rise beyond the growing lowland kingdoms, beyond the districts where new rulers were fastening their names to old landscapes. The western parts of Britain remained something different. They were not untouched by the storm. They had felt the collapse of Roman order, the pressure of migration, the spread of war, and the painful narrowing of British control elsewhere. Yet they did not yield in the same way. Wales, Cornwall, and parts of the northern British world became strongholds of resistance, memory, and continuity. If the East and Southeast were places where the future began to sound increasingly English, the West and far reaches became places where an older Britain held its breath, gathered its strength, and refused to disappear. The geography of these regions mattered immensely. Western Britain was not easy country for invaders seeking quick consolidation. Mountain ridges, river valleys, rough uplands, and peninsulas facing the Atlantic all made movement harder and control more expensive. Fertile land existed, but it was often broken by terrain that favored defenders who knew their own routes and refuges. A lowland agricultural kingdom can expand with relative speed across open country. Western resistance drew strength from friction. The land itself slowed enemies, narrowed fronts, and preserved local autonomy. in a century where geography could decide whether a people endured. Wales and Cornwall possessed advantages that the exposed eastern lowlands could not easily match, yet terrain alone never explained survival. The Western British polities also endured because they carried continuity of identity with unusual tenacity. Here Brittonic speech remained strong. Christian traditions, though locally varied, survived with deeper confidence. Genealogies, heroic memory, local kingship, and inherited claims to land remained rooted in communities that did not experience the same scale of settler transformation as much of the East. This did not make Western Britain peaceful or politically unified. Far from it. The West, too, contained rival rulers, shifting alliances, and endemic conflict. But its conflicts unfolded within a more recognizably British frame. The people fighting there still largely shared language, inherited culture, and memory of belonging to a Britain older than the new Saxon kingdoms pressing from the east. Wales in particular became a mosaic of small but resilient kingdoms. These were not modern national units, nor a single centralized state. They were regional powers shaped by dynasty, geography, and the practical demands of defense. Their rulers drew authority from local lineage, military capacity, and the protection of communities living close to the limits of subsistence and war. The persistence of these kingdoms matters because it shows that the making of Britain after Rome was not simply a story of replacement. It was a story of partition. While some regions were becoming something new under incoming elites, others preserved older forms of political and cultural life with remarkable endurance. Cornwall, too, stood as part of this Western continuity. Its peninsula geography gave it a distinctiveness and defensibility that helped preserve a Brittonic world longer than many Eastern observers might have imagined possible. Communities there could remain connected by sea as much as by land, linking them not only to the broader British West, but also to networks that faced the Atlantic rather than the North Sea. This is an important contrast. The East looked increasingly toward the continental world of Saxon and other settler connections. The West could look outward along different maritime lines, preserving another orientation, another horizon of belonging. The sea, once again, was not only a barrier, it was a road. But in the West, it could carry continuity as well as danger. The North presents an even more complex picture. British kingdoms there, including those later associated with the Old North, preserved traditions that would echo in poetry, heroic memory, and regional identity long after many of their political structures had altered or vanished. These northern Britons occupied a harsh and contested world, facing not only pressures linked to Anglo-Saxon expansion, but also neighboring powers with their own ambitions. Yet their persistence reminds us that British survival after Rome was never confined to one western edge. It stretched across multiple refuges and regional strongholds, all linked by the broader fact that the island's transformation remained incomplete. These western and northern zones did more than survive militarily. They preserved cultural memory. In lands where Brittonic speech remained dominant, the names of places, the cadences of poetry, the recollection of ancestors, and the moral meaning of resistance could be carried forward without translation into the language of conquerors. That fact is difficult to overstate. Where language survives, whole emotional worlds survive with it. Grief can still be named in inherited terms. Heroism can still be praised in old forms. The land itself remains legible through ancestral words. For communities watching the East transform under new rulers and new speech, this continuity would have been both consolation and charge. It told them that Britain had not been erased everywhere. It still spoke in its own voice. Christianity also flourished with distinctive force in parts of the West. Monastic traditions, local saints, and ecclesiastical communities became central to cultural endurance. In a fragmented political world, a church site could bind memory across generations more reliably than a royal hall. It could anchor education, preserve manuscripts, nurture local devotion, and shape ideas of sacred landscape. Western Christianity was not merely a residue of Roman life. In many places it became a creative, regionally rooted force in its own right. This helped Western Britain endure not only as a political refuge, but as an intellectual and spiritual one. There is, however, a danger in romanticizing these regions as untouched bastions of purity. The West was not frozen in time. It changed, adapted, fought, and negotiated. Its rulers made alliances, suffered defeats, and sometimes struggled among themselves with damaging intensity. Refugee movements from lost eastern territories may have deepened pressure in some districts. Resources were finite. Internal rivalries could be fierce. Resistance did not mean serenity. It meant sustained effort under narrowing circumstances. The Western kingdoms endured because they were flexible as well as stubborn, because they could absorb strain without ceasing to recognize themselves. The very existence of these British strongholds had political consequences for the whole island. They ensured that the newcomers in the lowlands could never imagine uncontested supremacy too early. There were always frontiers to the west, upland spaces where another language held, other kings ruled, and another memory of Britain remained active. This shaped warfare, diplomacy, and identity on both sides. The eastern kingdoms could advance, raid, and pressure. But they also faced a persistent reminder that the island's past had not entirely yielded to their future. The West became both refuge and challenge, a living counterargument to the idea that Britain's transformation was complete. This matters because historical change often seems most decisive when viewed from the side that eventually prevails in writing broad narratives. Yet from within the 6th century itself, the outcome remained open in many places. Wales, Cornwall, and the northern British realms prove that. They show a Britain still plural, still contested, still capable of sustaining rival futures. One future would grow through the expanding Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of the lowlands. Another held on in the West, carrying forward Brittonic language, Christian continuity, and the stubborn memory of a land that had once belonged to Rome but had never been only Roman. So the Western resistance was more than delay. It was preservation with consequence. It kept alive older political forms, older sacred habits, and older speech long enough to shape the island for centuries to come. It gave refuge to memory. It gave identity a defensible landscape. It ensured that when Britain divided, it did not divide into emptiness on one side and destiny on the other. It divided into living worlds, each bearing its own legitimacy, its own grief, and its own claim to the future. In the mountains, valleys, monasteries, and peninsulas of the West, Britain did not merely retreat, it endured. And in enduring, it kept the struggle unfinished. By now, the island no longer resembled a single fallen province waiting to be restored. It had hardened into separate zones of power, memory, and expectation. This was the deeper legacy of the brutal generations after Rome. Britain was becoming not one broken thing, but several living things side by side, each with its own rulers, languages, sacred landscapes, and ideas of legitimacy. In the East and South, kingdoms shaped by settler elites were consolidating land. naming territory, and rooting their future in dynasties that no longer thought of themselves as temporary arrivals. In the West and parts of the North, British polities endured with older speech, Christian continuity, and the stubborn conviction that they still represented the truer inheritance of the island. The division was no longer only military, it had become civilizational. This is a crucial moment in the story, because it marks the point at which repeated conflict stops feeling like emergency and begins to feel like structure. For generations, people had lived with raids, betrayals, refugee movement, and campaigns fought for immediate survival. But over time, those upheavals produced habits. Frontiers became familiar. Rival peoples became permanent neighbors. Children were born into landscapes where the enemy was not an unexpected intruder, but a known presence beyond the ridge, the river, or the forest belt. Such normalization changes everything. Hatred becomes inherited. Diplomacy becomes possible, but brittle. Marriage, tribute, hostage-taking, and raiding all settle into recurring forms. War does not end. It becomes part of the architecture of life. In eastern lowland Britain, authority increasingly rested in the hands of rulers whose political world was no longer Roman or British in the older sense. Their identities were becoming dynastic, territorial, and self-reproducing. They held halls, commanded war bands, distributed land, and presided over communities that now thought of their future in connection with Kent, Sussex, Wessex, or other emerging realms. These kingdoms were still rough, still unstable, still dependent on martial success, but they possessed one enormous advantage over the shattered British order that had faced the first waves of crisis. They were growing into themselves. They did not need to restore a lost province. They needed only to expand what they had already begun. For the British West, survival required a different mental discipline. It was not enough to remember what had been lost. Memory had to be turned into endurance. Welsh and Cornish rulers, along with northern British leaders where they still held, were now governing in a world that could not be made Roman again. Their task was not restoration in full, but preservation under pressure. That is a harder calling than triumph. It asks a people to accept that the world has narrowed while refusing to let the narrowing define them completely. It asks them to continue speaking, praying, ruling, and fighting in inherited forms even when rival powers are becoming wealthier, more territorially secure, and more confident in their own expansion. Language made this division visible at the level of daily life. Speech now marked not only ancestry, but political horizon. In one region, the sounds of Old English spread through fieldwork, law, kinship, and local rule. In another, Brittonic remained the language of belonging, grief, praise, and prayer. Latin persisted in sacred and learned settings, but no longer bound the island together as it once had. A person crossing Britain in this age would have moved not only through different territories, but through different verbal worlds. Place names shifted, legal formulas shifted, oral poetry shifted. Children learned different futures with their first words. This is how deep division becomes. It enters the mouth. Burial custom, too, continued to reinforce this separation. Cemeteries on one side of a frontier might proclaim identity through furnished graves, weapon burials, and material styles tied to continental traditions. On the other side, Christian practice and local continuity shaped remembrance differently. Such differences taught communities how to imagine themselves. The dead beneath the soil were not silent in a cultural sense. They instructed the living. They made belonging visible. A valley where generations of one people buried their kin became more than a resource. It became ancestral ground. This sacred attachment intensified the permanence of division. Land ceased to be merely strategic. It became intimate. Trade and contact still crossed these boundaries. Rival societies rarely live in total isolation, especially on an island where rivers, coasts, and practical necessity press people together. Goods moved, skills moved, stories moved, captives moved. Some local arrangements must have been pragmatic rather than ideological. Border communities often know each other too well to maintain pure hatred without interruption. Yet contact did not erase separation. It often sharpened it. The more one group encounters the customs of another, the more clearly each may define what makes it distinct. Britain after Rome had become a land of such sharpened distinctness. This division also altered the meaning of history itself. For Eastern kingdoms rising from settler foundations, the past could increasingly be narrated as heroic arrival, hard-won settlement, and rightful expansion. For Western British communities, the past remained tied to continuity, endurance, and loss. These are not merely different political perspectives. They are different emotional chronologies. One tells a story of becoming. The other tells a story of surviving. Each shapes what kinds of leaders are honored, what kinds of poems are composed, and what kinds of futures can be imagined. A divided Britain was therefore also a divided memory. And yet division does not always mean stasis. In some ways, these rival worlds sharpened each other into greater coherence. The Eastern kingdoms became more aware of themselves as territorial powers because British resistance remained alive to the West. The Western polities became more conscious of their British identity because the East was becoming unmistakably other. Frontiers do not merely separate, they define along them. Identities that might otherwise remain loose or local can harden into something broader. That process was underway now. Britain's fragmentation was producing new kinds of political self-awareness on all sides. There is a melancholy grandeur in this stage of the story. The island still carried Rome's roads, ruined towns, and old sacred foundations, but its future was no longer being shaped by imperial withdrawal alone. It was being shaped by the long coexistence of rival successor worlds. One was increasingly Anglo-Saxon in speech, dynastic ambition, and settlement pattern. The other remained British in language, memory, and Christian continuity. Neither was simple. Neither was pure. Both contained internal rivalries and local variation. But together they formed the new reality of the island. Britain was not waiting to become something. It had already become divided. This is why the phrase "a Britain divided" carries such weight. It does not describe only borders on a map. It describes a transformation in how people inhabited the land. They no longer assumed the same political center, the same sacred frame, or the same historical inheritance. They lived beside each other, traded, fought, raided, buried, married, and remembered differently. The brutal war had done more than decide who controlled certain fields or fortresses. It had created parallel worlds, and those worlds would endure, not unchanged, not without future conversions, alliances, and reconstructions, but endure nonetheless. The island's later history, its languages, kingdoms, literatures, and identities would all grow out of this partitioned ground. The frontier between Britain and Anglo-Saxon, between West and East, between survival and expansion, was not the end of the story, but it was one of its deepest foundations. Britain after Rome had become an island of neighboring destinies, each watching the other across contested land, each convinced that its own memory carried the truer claim, and each preparing, in different ways, to shape what the island would one day be called. From the violence of collapse, migration, and resistance, something new had taken shape, though no one living through it could yet have seen its full outline. The land that Rome had once called Britannia was no longer a single political imagination. In its eastern and southern lowlands, the emerging Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had begun to turn hard-won settlement into a more enduring order. Their rulers held land not merely by raid, but by inheritance. Their followers expected continuity. Their halls gathered tribute, oath, feasting, and war under one roof. Their speech spread through households. Their dead filled local cemeteries. Their frontiers pressed outward. This was not yet England in the later sense, not yet one kingdom, not yet one law, not yet one people entirely certain of itself. But the foundations were there. The brutal centuries after Rome had made such a future possible. What does it mean to say that war created England? It does not mean that a single battle, a single conqueror, or a single migration suddenly brought a nation into being. It means that prolonged conflict changed the conditions under which identity could take root. The old Roman province had been too broad, too diverse, and too dependent on imperial machinery to survive unchanged once that machinery failed. In its place came regional powers, some British, some Anglo-Saxon, all hardened by the need to defend, dominate, and endure, over time, among the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms especially. Repeated war forced rulers to think beyond immediate plunder, to survive against rivals and expand at their expense. They had to organize land, loyalty, and memory more effectively. War did not merely destroy, it trained. In the eastern lowlands, where migration had been strongest and settlement deepest, this training produced something historically decisive: the ruling houses of Kent, Sussex, Wessex, and others began to understand territory not only as spoils, but as patrimony. A district was no longer simply where a war band happened to be strong. It was becoming a realm with ancestral legitimacy, a place where dynasties claimed right through lineage, martial success, and the growing normality of their presence. This shift from occupation to belonging is one of the great political transformations of the age. It gave rulers reason to preserve as well as seize, to cultivate alliances, regulate succession, and root their power in the land itself. The people living under these emerging kingdoms were being changed by the same process. A farmer in the lowlands might once have seen incoming warriors as dangerous strangers, or perhaps as one more group among many in a chaotic century. But if his children grew up under the rule of a local king, whose power seemed stable, if the speech of authority in market and household became Old English, if neighboring communities shared the same burial practices and loyalties, then what had once been disruption could become ordinary life. A generation born into a new order does not experience it as new. It experiences it as the way things are. This is how political worlds become real, not when they are announced, but when they are inherited. At the same time, the existence of rival British polities in the West helped shape the Eastern kingdoms into sharper self-awareness. An identity often strengthens in contrast. The Anglo-Saxon realms did not define themselves in a vacuum. They defined themselves against neighboring British communities, against rival Eastern rulers, and against the memory of the struggle that had first won them room to exist. Conflict gave them boundaries, and boundaries gave them coherence. A kingdom that must defend itself regularly begins to think more clearly about who belongs within it. War, in this sense, taught difference. It taught rulers whom they commanded, whom they feared, and whom they hoped to absorb or defeat. The creation of England was therefore not only a matter of bloodline or migration, it was also a matter of political habit. Kingdoms learned to endure. Rulers learned to pass claims to heirs. Retainers learned to imagine service as part of a continuing order rather than a temporary emergency. Priests and later church institutions would, in time, give these realms additional sacred and administrative structure. Law codes would emerge. Conversion would reshape kingship. Literacy would recover new force. But before any of that could happen fully, the lowland kingdoms had to survive the age of raw formation. They had to be born in war and yet not remain only warbands forever. That was the crucial achievement of these generations. There is a paradox here. The same conflict that devastated Roman Britain also cleared the space for a new political culture to grow. The destruction of one order made room for another, but that room was not empty. It had to be fought for, settled, remembered, and defended. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms inherited roads they had not built, fields first organized under other systems, and landscapes already thick with sacred and ancestral meaning. They did not create their world from bare ground. They built within the ruins and afterlives of Rome and Britain, both. England, when it eventually emerged more fully, would therefore be a layered creation. It would be Germanic in speech and much of political lineage, Roman in certain institutional inheritances, Christian in sacred structure, and deeply marked by centuries of struggle against the surviving British West. Its roots were mixed, but the war gave those roots their first chance to bind. For the Britons, this process looked very different. What Eastern rulers experienced as consolidation often appeared from the West as narrowing, loss, and hardening frontier. That contrast matters because England was not created in a moral vacuum. It emerged through conquest, displacement, adaptation, and the long reduction of British influence across much of the lowland South and East. To say that the war created England is also to say that it broke another possible future for Britain. History often works this way. One people's foundation is another people's contraction. The island's future did not become English because fate had always intended it. It became English because generations of violence, settlement, and political consolidation made one outcome stronger than its rivals in key regions. Still, nothing was inevitable. That is worth remembering. There were moments when British resistance held, moments when expansion paused, moments when new kingdoms were still fragile and uncertain. The lowland realms that would contribute to the making of England could have failed. They could have remained isolated pockets. They could have been pushed back, absorbed, or shattered by rivalry. What made their eventual significance possible was not destiny, but persistence. They endured long enough for identity, language, kinship, and rule to fuse. This is why the phrase "from war to England" feels both stark and true. It captures the harshness of the transformation. England did not begin as a peaceful cultural flowering. It began as a result of survivors, settlers, fighters, and rulers forcing unstable landscapes into durable shape. Halls replaced camps. Dynasties replaced temporary commanders. Local loyalties widened into territorial ones. Speech spread with settlement. Memory attached itself to ruling houses and named regions. The island had not yet become one English kingdom, but the pieces from which that future would be assembled were now in place, hammered into form by generations that knew far more of danger than of peace. If one listens carefully, there is something almost grimly intimate in this creation. It happened not only through famous battles and royal ambition, but through marriages, harvests, oaths, land grants, funeral rites, and the raising of children who would never remember a world before these new kingdoms. The war had opened the way. The everyday life that followed made the change permanent. What had been won by shield and fire was secured by plow, cradle, and inheritance. So, by the end of this stage, the island stood altered beyond reversal. Britain remained divided, and much of its future still unwritten. Yet in the East and South especially, a new political world had taken root strongly enough that later centuries would look back and recognize in it the beginning of England, not the finished kingdom, not the polished nation of later imagination, but the rough first architecture, raised out of fear, conflict, ambition, and endurance. Rome had fallen away. Britain had fought, fractured, and resisted. And from that long, brutal struggle, another future had begun to speak in its own name. What remains after such centuries of fire, migration, fear, and endurance? Roads remain, though broken. Earthworks remain, though softened by rain and grass. Cemeteries remain, their dead still arranged according to loves, loyalties, and beliefs no living witness can now fully recover. Place names remain, some carrying Brittonic memory, some Old English settlement, some older layers worn almost smooth by time. Above all, the question remains: how did a Roman province become a divided island of rival futures? And how did that division shape the long road that followed? The answer lies not in one event, but in the accumulation of human choices under pressure, in the way people adapted when order failed, and in the way memory survived even when power changed hands. To look back on post-Roman Britain is to confront a world that refused simplicity. It was not merely an age of collapse, though collapse was real. It was not merely an age of invasion, though migration and conquest transformed the land. It was not merely an age of heroic resistance, though resistance gave the period some of its deepest moral force. It was all of these at once. Rome's withdrawal exposed the island, but exposure alone did not determine the future. Communities still acted, leaders still rose, families still married, buried, sowed, and prayed. Newcomers did not enter an empty stage. They entered a wounded but living country. The Britain that emerged from this encounter was therefore not a single inheritance. It was a layered one, built out of ruin and adaptation together. This is why the archaeology of the age feels so poignant. Every trench opened in a ruined town, every isotopic study of a skeleton, every grave good lifted from the soil, every reoccupied hill fort, every timber hall traced in post holes, all of it whispers the same truth. Great transformations are lived locally. Empire falls in the language of historians, but for the people inside it, the change comes as unpaid soldiers, silent baths, missing coins, smoke on the horizon, strange accents at the market, a daughter marrying into a newcomer household, a son buried with a weapon instead of a prayer, a village abandoning open fields for a defended rise. The making of Britain after Rome happened not in grand abstraction, but in such intimate rearrangements of life. And perhaps that is why the period continues to grip the imagination so powerfully. It sits at the threshold between history and legend. We can trace roads and graves. We can recover settlement patterns. We can compare genomes and pottery styles. We can reconstruct dietary shifts, migration signals, and changing frontiers. Yet still, For the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not know every battle site. We do not know every alliance broken under pressure. We do not know whether Arthur was one man, several, or a hero shaped from communal need. We do not know all the songs sung in British strongholds as they watched the lowlands change. The gaps in the record are not a failure of inquiry. They are part of the age itself. It was a century of partial light. That partial light teaches something important about human history. Civilizations do not vanish cleanly, and they are not replaced cleanly either. They overlap. They linger in stone, in law, in sacred habit, in road lines and field systems, in the prestige of a language no longer widely spoken, in the resentment of people who remember another order, and in the ambitions of those determined to found a new one. The Britain of the 5th and 6th centuries was filled with such overlap. Roman memory lived in British leadership and Christian continuity. British resilience lived in Western kingdoms and in the legends that would preserve their struggle. Anglo-Saxon settlement lived in cemeteries, halls, and the spread of Old English. England would emerge from that mixture, but so too would Wales and the enduring distinction of the British West. The island's later identities all grew from this fractured soil. There is also a moral lesson, though not a simple one. We often like histories of origin to be clean, noble, and singular. Yet the creation of Britain's later worlds was neither clean nor singular. It involved suffering, displacement, courage, opportunism, adaptation, and the hard invention of legitimacy after a larger order had failed. One people's survival became another people's narrowing. One kingdom's foundation rested on another community's loss. Yet amid all this, human dignity did not disappear. It appears in the very fact that people continued to build meaning under terrible conditions. They raised halls and churches. They preserved poems and prayers. They taught children to speak their language, whichever language that was. They buried their dead carefully. They remembered who they thought they were. That may be the deepest legacy of all. The road of history is long, but it is made from such acts of memory. A people endures not only by winning battles, but by deciding that certain things will continue to matter even in defeat or danger. The Britons of the West did this through language, kingship, and Christian continuity. The emerging Anglo-Saxon polities did it through settlement, dynasty, and the creation of new regional identities. Both were shaping the future. Even while contesting the same land, the island became what it became because its inhabitants refused passivity. They suffered history, but they also made it. Today, when we walk through Britain and see a Roman wall line, an early medieval cemetery in a museum case, a church on an ancient site, or a landscape still bearing names from different linguistic worlds, we are seeing the afterimage of that struggle. The modern map hides the violence that made it possible, but the ground remembers. Beneath fields, suburbs, and hedgerows lie the remains of the age when Rome fell away and the island had to renegotiate everything: loyalty, language, power, holiness, and belonging. Only time will tell what future discoveries will still be made, what graves will be reopened by scholarship, what forgotten halls will emerge from soil, what genetic patterns will sharpen old debates, what place names will reveal still older memories. The past is not done with us yet, and perhaps that is fitting. Post-Roman Britain was an age obsessed with inheritance. People asked, in their own ways, who belongs here? Whose ancestors speak through this land? Whose gods or God watch over it? Whose future should prevail? We ask similar questions still, though with different tools and less blood on our hands. One hopes. The fascination of this period lies partly in that recognition. These were not lesser people stumbling through darkness. They were our intellectual and emotional equals, confronting the collapse of a system larger than themselves and trying, with incomplete knowledge and painful courage, to build livable worlds in its place. So when we reflect on the brutal war that created Britain, or rather the Britons that followed Rome, we should do so with humility. The age gave us no perfect heroes, no pure origins, no single rightful claimant to the island's future. What it gave instead was something more real. It gave us a record of people enduring transition at the limit of certainty. Some fought to preserve an older order. Some fought to establish a new one. Some adapted quietly, marrying across lines, shifting speech, serving whichever ruler held the land. All of them belonged to the making of what came later. In that sense, the legacy of post-Roman Britain is not only political, it is philosophical. It reminds us that history is seldom the triumph of one clean story. More often, it is a negotiation between ruins and ambition, memory and necessity, grief and invention. Rome fell, Britain fractured, new kingdoms rose, old languages retreated and survived. Legends grew where records thinned, and through it all, men and women continued to live, choose, mourn, and hope. That is what remains. Not only the kingdoms that followed, nor only the names later maps would fix, but the human truth beneath them. A world ended. Several worlds began. And beneath the rain-washed hills and ancient roads of Britain, the earth still holds the quiet evidence that from collapse can come not silence, but transformation, uncertain, costly, and enduring.